Chapter 124. I slept for a while in the afternoon, so today's update will be a little late. Divinity. A very powerful force. Gods had three core parts: divinity, divinity, and priesthood. Divinity could be understood as the divine bloodline. The body of a god was in the form of energy, not the flesh and blood of a mortal. Therefore, a god would not have any fatal injuries, which meant that they were immune to any fatal attacks. Even if they fell into the range and turned into saints, they would still be in a semi-energy state. Gods would not die immediately when their hearts were pierced. Even without a heart, they could continue to survive. Therefore, many divine creatures were immune to backstab. Immune to fatal damage, but some parts of the attack would have a heavy hit effect, and the damage would increase a lot. Divinity was an extremely powerful bloodline power. It could be given to believers by gods, and it could also be left in the bodies of their descendants. The level of divinity was the same as divinity. It could be classified into minor divinity, intermediate divinity, and great divinity. A grade of divinity could increase all attributes by 1. It was equivalent to the average attribute points brought by 12 profession levels, and at the same time, it could reduce any damage by 10%. The power of divinity could offset any physical and magical damage, and it could also be stacked with the damage reduction caused by the level of divinity. The power of the law would be integrated into the body of divinity. Gods with great divine power could offset about 90% of any damage under normal circumstances. Except for the demigod Lich, who could barely rely on the body of the undead to achieve about 90 to 95% of physical damage reduction, no other creature could be compared with the gods with great divine power. The additional ability of the demon bloodline was an extremely weakened divine bloodline. There were many powerful demons in the abyss with divinity, and the level of divinity was quite high. Therefore, even if they were not demons, they were not afraid of powerful gods. Of course, the additional ability of divinity was not limited to these. Soren only knew the most basic additional ability. According to the difference in divinity, there would be additional spell-like abilities, supernatural abilities, the power of the plain law, and so on. There were many creatures with strong divinity but no divinity or priesthood, such as elemental jinn, high-level demons, 100-armed giants, abominations, and so on. These divine creatures had divinity but no divinity, let alone priesthood. However, they weren't any weaker than many deities. The Son of Fear definitely did not have a clergy. Priesthood was built on the basis of divinity. The divinity of the Dread Lord was still in the abyss, still in his soul. He distributed his own divinity and divine power. These divine powers were like a barrel of refined gasoline. Once it was used up, it was basically gone. The existence of the divine persona continued to supply them with divine power, so their divine power was endless. If he cut off the supply of divine power, the divine power of all the Sons of Fear would drop rapidly. Elven Rangers had divine power and divinity, but they had no divine personality or divine title. When Soren killed him, his divine power was transferred to Vivian. Logically speaking, his divinity should have been transferred to Vivian as well. However, divinity was a type of soul-like energy. When gods killed each other, they would also deprive each other of their divinity. That was why Soren had absorbed the divinity into his body. Although divinity could bring great power, it also contained the will of the Dread Lord. It could be simply understood as a kind of soul fragment that turned into divinity energy. Divine power gathered in a Son of Fear. Divinity also gathered in a Son of Fear. The soul fragment of the Dread Lord merged in the Son of Fear's body and became a new soul imprint of the Dread Lord. His will would also be transferred to the Son of Fear, who had merged with a large amount of divinity. Finally, he would directly destroy the other party's soul and take back all his divine power to resurrect. This was a battle of wills. It was also the most difficult battle of wills in history. After many gods defeated their opponents, their own wills were affected by other people's divinity. In the process of merging divinity, there was an extremely difficult test of will. If your will was higher than your opponent's, the power of divinity would completely transform into your own power. If your will was lower than your opponent's, then the opponent's residual will would affect your consciousness and may even occupy your consciousness to resurrect. There were many eccentric gods. These guys' extreme personalities were the key to being influenced by divinity. The residual divinity retained the core of the original god's will. For example, the power of the divinity of lust. The gods who had mastered the divinity of lust in the past were all temperamental and keen on all kinds of enjoyment. They liked to do things that were incomprehensible. These gods fell one after another, but the personalities of their avatars were all the same. The reason was that they were affected by the residual divinity. The most extreme divinity was stacked layer by layer. The more gods they had, the more extreme emotions and preferences they would have. That was why there were so many crazy gods. Merging divinity was a battle of wills. If Soren could suppress the will of the Dread Lord, then he would be able to transform the power of the divinity. If he failed, his consciousness would be closer to the devil, and he might even be controlled by him. It was dangerous. It was also very tempting. The path for mortals to become gods was destined to be full of thorns. If they wanted to walk on this path, they would not be able to reach the end without great determination and perseverance. Many legendary wizards did not dare to become gods because they could not suppress the will of the divinity. They were afraid that their personality would change drastically, and they were afraid that they would magnify certain emotions to the extreme. They were even more afraid that they would gradually lose themselves. This was very fatal for wizards. They already had a long lifespan and great power. Why would they gamble everything to become gods? Stepping into the realm of the gods was equivalent to entering the battlefield of the gods. 10 years ago, 10 years later, your personality was constantly changing, and your behavior was also gradually changing. It was because of change that everything was endless. From naive and childish to mature and steady, from frivolous behavior to sophisticated handling of affairs. The biggest danger of divinity was not the change, but whether you could hold on to yourself in the battle of wills and not let your true soul lose its direction. If you lost your way in the battle of power, even gods would become crazy. There were many gods like this, especially those who became gods because of luck. In the end, all of them had strange personalities. That was why many legendary wizards were afraid. In history, the number of people who became gods as wizards could be counted on one hand. Soren's current state was not suitable for absorbing divinity. Although he was confident in his own will, he was not arrogant enough to think that he could completely suppress the Dread Lord. However, if he succeeded in suppressing these 3 points of divinity, then the Dread Lord's will would completely disappear. In other words, a part of the soul imprint that he transferred to the deity's body would completely disappear. No matter which deity he planned to resurrect in the future, the final battle of wills would weaken a lot because a part of his soul was completely swallowed by Soren. The divine power was in Vivian's body, and the divinity was in Soren's body. Although Vivian's power was weakened, part of the test of will was transferred to Soren. According to the normal process. The stronger the divine power of the deity of fear, the more divinity there would be in the body, and the easier it would be to be affected. But now, the result was that the divine power in Vivian's body had doubled, but the divinity was still the same. Soren felt that he seemed to have found a way to fight against the Dread Lord. If all the divine power was transferred to Vivian's body, and all the divinity was suppressed by him, then the plan to resurrect the Dread Lord would fail by half. Vivian had strong divine power, but she was not affected by the divinity. The final result was a balance. If the Dread Lord was more important, then the divinity of fear would be transferred to him. If Vivian was more important, then the divinity of fear would be transferred to her, because the Dread Lord's own divinity had disappeared and scattered. It was as if Soren had cleared up his thoughts and cleared up his mind. His expression was cold, and the killing intent in his eyes was very strong. Because he found a way to fight against the Dread Lord as a mortal. That was, he would kill the other surviving deities of fear. Killing. This was what Soren was best at. Killing for Vivian was the most normal thing to do. Just like when the little girl would raise her little head and say without hesitation, "If you kill people, I'll set the fire for you." Soren also did not hesitate to kill those sons of fear for Vivian. A night passed just like that. When dawn broke, Soren took out a long sword and began to practice the White Raven sword art. Combat skills were honed by oneself bit by bit. If he wanted to master such a high-level combat skill, he still needed to put in a lot of effort. Talents could enhance the speed of mastering combat skills, but it could not directly let you obtain the combat skills. Rogues were not impulsive people. Soren was not a reckless idiot. He needed more planning and more strength. An hour later, he finished practicing the White Raven sword art. His slow movements looked a little awkward, and there was no handsome look to it. It was as if one movement was split into dozens of movements. It looked very stiff, and there was no smooth and handsome look at all. The White Raven sword art was second only to the cross sword art. It was cool, arrogant, and sharp. It could only be said that Soren really put in a lot of effort in practicing it. Because he learned the military version of the White Raven sword art. The owner of the inn got up and watched for a while. Then she boiled a basin of hot water and brought it to him. Soren thanked her and washed his body. His muscles looked like they were made of steel. She could not help but take a second look at him. There were many people in this era who had a strong body. Their muscles were much more exaggerated than Soren's, but there were very few people who were as well proportioned and strong as him. Especially the small muscles on his body. Although the owner of the inn did not know much about them, she knew that only powerful adventurers had them. This represented a kind of explosive power, and a strong sense of balance. Rogues rarely had large muscles. They looked thin, but when they took off their clothes, you would find that their whole body was obviously filled with small muscles. Their combat skills were based on their sense of balance. When they moved, they did not only have large muscles on their chest, arms, and legs. The more they pursued balance, the more obvious their small muscles would be. The more they pursued strength, the more exaggerated their large muscles would be. The typical example of this was the barbarians. Their large muscles on their arms were as thick as a human's leg. This represented the main focus of their strength training. The latter could be seen at a glance, but the former could only be seen in battle. Soren simply washed up, ate something, and went to the blacksmith's shop. He wanted to see the progress of the curved sword. A good weapon was more important than other rare equipment. Killing. Mainly relying on the sword. Chapter 125. The smithy was bustling with activity. The elven blacksmith's eyes were bloodshot, but his face was filled with excitement. He ordered his apprentices to work and increased the temperature of the furnace from time to time. There were all kinds of rare materials on the side, but not all of them were rare grade items. Most of them were just rare minerals. Forging wasn't something that could be done by directly embedding or simply mixing them together. It could be done with a spell. Forging in this world was a very advanced process, and it was definitely one of the most difficult skills to master. In some ways, it was even more sci-fi than forging in the interstellar era. The special materials were used as tools similar to carbizing catalysts. The rare minerals were used to add small amounts of other elements during hammering, similar to spring steel. The holy water on the side was used as a core material for secondary quenching. There were also some other rare items that Soren didn't know about. The rare grade weapons in this world were hammered out one by one. Spells were only the later enchantments. The equipment in the abyss of hell was also forged using volcanic furnaces. Soren looked at it and realized that he wasn't very good at it. The elven blacksmith hammered the metal with a strange rhythm. After hammering for 100 times, he sprinkled some ground powder and repeated the hammering process. The elements of the mineral powder would seep into the fish scale pattern steel, and the impurities would be removed during the hammering process. Only after 100 times of hammering could a rare grade weapon be called a rare grade weapon. Only then could a rare grade weapon be undamaged in an intense battle. Without rare materials like adamantine and mithril, this was the only way to achieve the best results. This type of steel ingot existed in ancient times as well. It was called wrought iron in the Central Plains, wood steel in some areas, and Damascus steel ingot in some places. Its forging process was similar to the elves' fish scale pattern steel ingot and the dwarves' titan steel ingot. There were very few people in the world who could afford to use rare materials like mithril and adamantine to forge. Usually, half of the country's resources were used to do so. Therefore, most of the time, these special ingots were used to forge. But for some reason, Soren was a little excited when he saw how focused the elven blacksmith was on forging. He had a strong feeling that the weapon he was going to forge this time wouldn't just be a rare grade 1 item. It was possible that the extreme effect of ordinary iron forging would appear. There were a few blacksmiths who could forge ordinary iron with the same effect as adamantine. Soren felt that the elven blacksmith in front of him probably had more than 200 points in forging skill. Judging from his 100-fold steel forging technique and his concentration while forging, it was possible that the elven blacksmith had close to 300 points in forging skill. The other party might be a blacksmith close to the level of a master blacksmith. The only flaw was that he did not learn alchemy. He probably didn't even know that he was close to the level of a master because it seemed that he had been forging in this village for many years. His skills had been stacked with time. Soren stayed for a while before leaving. He didn't disturb the focused elven blacksmith at all. The other party seemed to be in a state of madness. His expression was rather fanatical. He probably also felt that his skill was about to reach a breakthrough point. After decades of smithing, he had never thought that he would reach a critical point because of an order for a transcendent weapon. Soren returned to the inn and began to study magic. The more spell nodes and spell circuits he mastered, the faster he could learn other spells in the future, and the easier it would be for him to comprehend high-level spells. A master blacksmith's weapon was basically the limit for a mortal's weapon. Above that was magic enchantment, as well as the very sci-fi elemental collapse. Everything had a lot of space. Atoms and molecules had a lot of space, and protons and electrons had even more space. Elemental collapse was the collapse of these spaces. The Arcane Empire had a lot of in-depth research on this, because the strongest neutron star golem in the legends was made of elemental collapse. Soren once found some strange ores at the edge of the abyss, which was the point of contact between the plane and space. They were only the size of a fingernail, but they could weigh up to 3 kilograms. This was the elemental collapse material, and it was also an important material for legendary weapons. The weapons made were almost indestructible. It was also the only material that could resist supernatural magic enchantment. In the later stages of purebred warriors, after entering the legendary realm, they would forge their own exclusive weapon. This elemental collapse material was the core material for their weapon forging. Until now, there was still a battle axe in the abyss, and even the 100-armed giant couldn't pull it out. If Soren remembered correctly, its strength should be around 45 points. This strength was enough to move mountains and fill oceans. In the underwater ruins, there was a document that recorded part of the neutron star golem's data. It was only 5 meters tall, and its size was similar to a steel golem. It weighed 300,000 tons, and it was almost immune to all physical and magical attacks. In the entire Arcane Empire, there was only one neutron star golem. Because of some mistakes, a piece of the continental shelf sank, and in the end, the neutron star golem disappeared completely. Only in the legendary golem craftwork would there be some records about the neutron star golem. Soren would definitely go to the abyss in the future. This was because the materials he needed to forge supernatural weapons could only be found in places like the abyss, and the elemental collapse material could directly block many magic attacks. This was because even magic attacks couldn't penetrate it. Time passed little by little. Soren was very patient. Every day, he would practice the White Raven sword style regularly, and then he would learn the structure of spells. Occasionally, he would also practice his casting skills. He had a feeling that he would soon master the ability, spell control. The innkeeper's attitude towards him was a lot friendlier. On one hand, it was because of Kindler, and on the other hand, it was probably because she was more familiar with him. She didn't think that he was a dangerous person. In fact, Soren looked very handsome. As long as he wasn't in a state of battle, he would look like a quiet scholar. The elven blacksmith's eyes were getting more and more bloodshot, and he was getting more and more excited. Soren was even asked to buy more than 100 Kindler's special materials. It was an unknown material that was refined using divine spells and alchemy. It was an unknown material used to forge holy weapons. Anyway, even if he didn't know what it was, Soren still bought it without hesitation. This was because his custom-made curved sword was almost finished. 3 days passed quickly. The elven blacksmith didn't sleep much. His eyes were bloodshot, and 2 of his apprentices had already collapsed from exhaustion. When Soren arrived on the 4th day, the elven blacksmith finally showed a smile. Clang! A curved sword that was covered with tiny fish scales appeared in front of Soren. The hilt was very simple, and it didn't look like the style of an elven weapon. There were only faint patterns on the hilt, and it looked like the unique mark of a blacksmith. The elven blacksmith had already opened the blade overnight. He looked at Soren and smiled happily. Then, he swung the sword at the iron felt next to the furnace. Clang! A corner of the iron felt was cut off, and the thickness of the cut was close to 5 centimeters. The elven blacksmith didn't seem to use too much strength, and he was able to cut off a corner of the iron felt. There wasn't a single scratch on the snow-white blade, and it looked just like how it was before. Armor break. Soren's pupils shrank, and his expression changed. He quickly walked over to the elven blacksmith. Ha ha ha. The elven blacksmith laughed hysterically, and then he held the curved sword in his hand in front of Soren. Soren took the curved sword with a solemn expression, and then slightly bowed to show his respect. It was really the ultimate forging of ordinary iron. Only the armor break attribute could achieve such an effect. This was already close to the strongest grade 1 weapon. Item type, curved sword +1, unenchanted. Item grade, rare, grade 1. Item description, a weapon made from 100-fold forged steel. Other materials were mixed into it during the forging process. It was made from the elven clan's fish scale steel ingot, and it underwent a second quenching process. All attributes of this weapon exceed that of other weapons. Equipment requirements, 12 strength or above. Equipment effects, fish scale steel ingot, +3 sharpness, +3 penetration, +1 toughness, +1 armor break. Soren's expression was a little excited. He stretched out his finger and gently stroked the curved sword's delicate body. He could feel the tiny fish scales rubbing against his fingertips. Soren lifted his finger and lightly flicked the blade. He could hear a crisp sound, as if it had a trace of magic. He couldn't help but murmur, "This sword is qualified to be used to slay a dragon." The elven blacksmith's tired eyes suddenly lit up, and he excitedly said, "That's right. It can definitely break through the dragon scales of a pure-blood dragon. That's why I named it, Dragon Slayer." Soren was suddenly stunned. As the one who forged this curved sword, the elven blacksmith in front of him did indeed have the right to name it. But this name was a bit of a pain in the ass, right? He suddenly wanted to slap his own mouth. Chapter 126. The blacksmith fell to the ground as soon as he finished his sentence. The others were shocked. Soren thought that the blacksmith had died from exhaustion, but the blacksmith soon started snoring. He waved his hand at the apprentices next to him, signaling them to move the blacksmith to the bed and leave a dozen kindlers by the furnace. The apprentices were exhausted after 3 days of hard work. Their eyes were bloodshot, and they looked very tired. Soren was very satisfied with the result, so he didn't mind giving them a small tip. Dragon Slayer. Soren stroked the blade and curled his lips. This name is too inauspicious. Let's just call it Laceration. There were a lot of equipment called Dragon Slayer in this world. For example, there was a Dragon Slayer sword in Whiterun City. Any equipment with this name that succeeded in slaying a dragon seemed to carry a curse. Their owners would often die in the hands of dragons. Soren didn't have much of a hobby when it came to slaying dragons. Only when it was necessary to do something that involved the dragon race would he not hesitate to slay them. Laceration was a rare weapon he once got. Although it wasn't as good as the one in front of him, it was quite similar in all aspects. Although this scimitar was only a grade 1 rare weapon, its attributes were already at grade 2. It didn't have any energy damage, but its sharpness and penetration were quite high. Gloria's enchanted weapon only added 2 points, but this scimitar already had 3 points of sharpness and penetration. To put it simply, this scimitar could break through natural armor with +3 defense. The most famous example of this was the drake. The drake's natural defense was its dragon skin, which gave it +3 defense. The last 2 attributes were the key. Toughness was a characteristic of elven weapons, and it definitely wouldn't break easily. Armor break was usually an additional attribute added by adamantine. It was very useful against dragons, demons, and liches. As long as it was a weapon with armor break, it would be able to break through dragon scales. It was also very effective against warriors with full body armor. Other than the full body armor that was hard to break, the other scales and chainmail could be broken through with 1 or 2 slashes. Since the weapon had been forged, Soren naturally didn't need to continue staying here. He had almost recovered from his injuries 2 days ago. In these 2 days, he had also studied about 70% of the charm person spell. Charm spells were more difficult to learn compared to other spells. Soren went to the inn to pay the bill and gave 1 or 2 kindler coins as a tip. Then, he went directly to the outside of the village. His arrival did not alarm too many people, and his departure was not noticed by many either. Adventurers were a group of travelers, and they would only stop when they were tired. In the lush green forest. After entering the wilderness, Soren's vigilance began to rise. He was now going all the way north along the elven forest, which might be thousands of kilometers away. There was an icebound valley on the edge of the Frost Kingdom. After passing through this valley, he would enter the Ice Kingdom. It used to be a big battlefield with many sunken underground ruins. What separated the North and the Ice Kingdom was a snow mountain range that stretched for hundreds of miles. Because of the special geography, the two had become 2 completely different worlds. Soren moved forward at a very fast speed. His extraordinary 20 points of constitution ensured that he could keep moving forward at a slow pace. As long as he didn't exceed the range of physical consumption, his recovery speed was almost the same as the speed of consumption. In just one morning, Soren had walked dozens of kilometers. The surrounding scenery had changed a lot. The trees in front of him were basically as thick as 3 people hugging together. These trees were at least hundreds of years old. This was the characteristic of the elven hinterland. The deeper he went, the older the trees were, and the more likely he would meet the legendary beautiful dryads. In other words, the spiritual embodiment of nature. Soren's footsteps suddenly stopped. He frowned and pulled out a piece of rag with his hand. The cloth was very smooth to the touch, and there were traces of blood on it. There should have been a battle in this location, and it should have happened in the last 3 days. The footprints on the ground were blurred, but he still judged the direction of the battle based on his intuition. He followed the tracks for 100 or 200 meters, and then saw the obvious traces of a battle. There were broken branches cut by swords, and very dense footprints. There was indeed a battle here. Soren observed for a while and was ready to leave. He was concerned about whether there would be an ambush ahead. He had no interest in these occasional battles because battles happen too frequently in this world. In an instant. Suddenly, Soren's figure paused for a moment. Then, he turned around and went behind a big tree. He seemed to have seen something in that split second. What appeared in front of him was a mark on a big tree. It was 5-inch deep claw marks. It was obvious that the attacker was very strong, and there was a dried blood stain on the tree trunk. Soren's expression instantly turned cold. His face was a little ferocious, and the murderous aura on his face was extremely strong. He stretched out his palm and gestured at the 5 claw marks on the tree, then slowly pressed it on his back. There were still 5 shallow red marks on his back. Even though the priests had used healing spells, they couldn't completely erase the scars left behind by that vicious attack. Soren silently held his curved sword in his hand, and then his figure gradually became blurred and finally disappeared into the shadows. That group of hunters. They didn't give up on the hunting ritual, and in the last 3 days, they had also killed another target. Soren would never mistake the 5 claw marks. The dark high-grade knoll almost killed him there. The killing intent in his heart made Soren thirst for blood. His injuries had basically healed, and the special abilities of the Shadow Dancer were all available. Soren, who had just obtained a rare-grade weapon, was ready to use the blood of these hunters as a sacrifice to his blade. Soren was not afraid of the number of enemies when he was alone. Because he was a rogue, the shadows and the forest were his best cover. His figure disappeared, and the power of the shadows covered his traces. Only when he walked on the bright ground could he see a blurry figure. This was because the level of sneak was not high enough. It required more than 200 points of sneak to become invisible in places without shadows. But this didn't matter much to Soren. He didn't put most of his skill points into sneak, which meant that he strengthened his other combat abilities. The wizard's invisibility could completely replace the effect of sneak when necessary. Looks like there are more than 20 of them. Soren stopped and looked at the ground. The footprints on the ground were messy, but he could see that it was a circular encirclement. It didn't look like it was left behind by an attack, but more like it was left behind by someone retreating. He pulled out the grass in front of him, and there was a piece of cloth left behind by the thorns. The texture and cloth were similar to the ones in front of him, but the pattern was somewhat familiar. He murmured, "Where have I seen this pattern before?" He identified the direction and continued to follow the tracks. Rogues were also good at tracking, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to reproduce the advanced profession of bounty hunter and assassin. Soren walked for about 1 or 2 kilometers and stopped in front of another big tree. There were 3 claw marks on it, and there were broken branches and shrubs nearby. He could hear the sound of a river in front of him. Looks like there was a fight here for a while. Soren reached out his hand and picked up the soil on the ground. It was dark red soil, and the area was not small. Although the body was gone, there should be a person here. Judging from the blood stains, the person should have died on the spot. There was obviously someone in front of him who used a sword to cut down the shrubs blocking the way. It seemed like the person they surrounded was not good at fighting, or he was weak, so the person protecting him had to clear the way and cut down the shrubs that were blocking his movement. Looks like they're dead. Soren only saw the traces of one person's death, but according to his estimation, the person shouldn't be able to run away. If he had to protect such a burden, he would not be able to escape the hunter's pursuit. He lost track of them by the river. There were no footprints on the other side, so it seemed like the person didn't cross the river. Soren walked along the river bank and soon found a new clue. He found a weapon and a torn piece of armor. An elven rapier? Soren picked up the broken rapier and looked around. He muttered to himself, "Could it be the elven noble I met the other day?" His guards seemed to be equipped with this kind of equipment. No wonder they looked so familiar. Normal elven patrol guards couldn't afford such expensive cloth. Does that mean that guy met the hunters? It should have happened 3 days ago. Soren met an elven noble in front of the Temple of Life in the village. He had a part of the elven queen's bloodline, and it seemed like he was a descendant of the divine blood. They must have met the hunters, and for some reason, they became the new target. What happened next was a battle to escape. His guards definitely couldn't beat a group of high-grade hunters. If I want to catch up, it should be in front. Soren's pupils shrank. His figure once again disappeared into the shadows, and then he sneaked towards the foot of the mountain in front of him. There were more mountains in the elven forest, but they weren't high. The terrain was hilly. According to Soren's estimation, the elven guards would at most cover the foot of the mountain in front of him, and then the hunters would catch up to them. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Soren suddenly stopped. He pulled out his curved sword and his footsteps became lighter. There were still traces in front of him. The traces were very obvious. There were at least 10 people moving around, and they should have been left behind today. He could also vaguely hear some voices. It seemed like there were people in front of him, and the number was more than 10. P.S. The second update will be a little later. Chapter 127. Soren didn't dare to get too close to it. The hunters had anti-tracking abilities, and the gnolls had a good sense of smell. They could smell the scent of a living person if they got too close to it. Soren's figure was completely shrouded in the shadows, and there were no traces of him at all. He was moving in the shadows, and there was no way he would expose himself in a place without shadows. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Soren was moving very slowly, and there were almost no footsteps. There was a gray hair near the bushes, and it didn't notice Soren even when he passed by it about a meter away. It was still busy eating something. There were traces of a bonfire in front of him, and it seemed that the hunters had spent the night here. There were also skinned beast carcasses nearby. They must have killed a wild boar last night, and there was still half of the boar's head left uneaten. A hybrid orc appeared in front of him. It looked at the foot of the mountain with a fierce expression, and it was rubbing its battle axe in its hand. And, at #%*, Soren couldn't understand what it was saying at all. It seemed to be the hybrid orc's dialect, and there was a little bit of pure orc language in it. This language couldn't be understood without learning it. He could only guess from its facial expressions and movements. The hybrid orc seemed to be angry, and it kept pointing at the foot of the mountain, as if it wanted to attack. The number of hunters had decreased a lot. Soren saw the dark high-grade knoll. There was a sword wound on its face, and it was staring at the hybrid orc coldly. It seemed that they hadn't finished the hunt. Something must have happened. Soren moved forward in the shadows, and went around 100 or 2 meters to the foot of the mountain. His expression gradually became serious, and the vegetation on the ground seemed too strong. He reached out and picked up a vine, and murmured, "What is this? Entanglement? No. It doesn't look like a simple spell effect. The power of a spell wouldn't last that long." Everything in front of him had obviously lasted for 2 or 3 days, and the plants were full of vitality for some reason. Droll? Soren approached the mountain bit by bit, and found that the foot of the mountain had become a sea of plants. There were green vines everywhere, and these plants seemed to have come alive. They swayed gently with the wind, and he could vaguely see signs of unreasonable activity. The exuberant plants were like a barrier, blocking the holes in all directions. Fresh blood could be seen in some places. The thorns on the vines had pierced into the bodies of some creatures, using their blood to maintain their existence. However, there were also signs of withering near the edges. Is this a living plant? Or did it change with divine power? Soren slowly pulled out his curved sword, not daring to get close to the vines that were obviously too vigorous. This kind of thing was definitely difficult to deal with. Even legendary rogues might be trapped in it if they were unlucky. Looking at the corpses inside the vines, they were definitely the corpses of high-grade hunters. At least 6 of them with a profession level of 15 or above had died in the vines. It seemed that they also tried to attack with fire, but these supernatural vines were not afraid of fire at all. Soren saw the figures of the elven guards. The number had decreased a lot. Only 3 of them were still standing. There were 4 or 5 lying on the ground next to them. It seemed that many of them had died. The handsome elven nobleman was still there, but he looked very embarrassed. There were 3 claw marks on his face, and his eyebrows were cut open. His face looked particularly ferocious. Judging from the wound, the nobleman was almost attacked in the temple. It doesn't look like a burst of divine power. Is it because of some legendary item? Soren stared at the elven nobleman in the distance. His expression was a little desperate. They had been trapped here for nearly 3 days. Most of his guards had died, and the rest were basically injured. They were obviously trapped here by the hunters, and only supported by the vines outside for so long. Time passed little by little. The despair on the elven nobleman's face became more and more obvious. The guard said something in his ear, but it was too far away to hear clearly. These vines could not last forever. If no one came to rescue them, these people would definitely die in the hands of the hunters. The sky was getting darker and darker. Soren quietly landed from the tree trunk and slowly moved forward along the shadows. Rogues were very patient, and Soren was even more patient. He was not in a hurry to attack, nor did he do anything that would expose his existence. He was like a bystander, always watching the movements of the group of people at the foot of the mountain, maintaining a distance of about 100 or 200 meters. Although the hunters were constantly arguing, they were still vigilant. Soren was sure that he could kill them in one shot, but he was not sure if he could retreat after attacking. He also did not approach the elves. First of all, Soren did not have the ability to help them get out of danger. Second, they might not trust him. He was not enthusiastic enough to risk his life to help someone who had nothing to do with him. There were 12 hunters in this group. Half of them were around professional level 12, and the other half were all high-grade professions with professional level 15 and above. Half of them were mixed orcs. Although the high-grade gnoll was very strong, its voice seemed to have been weakened a lot. The hunters were roasting meat. They had sent someone to hunt a goat. Some people tried to get close to the vines, but when they saw the dancing thorns, they immediately retreated. They seemed to be very scared. Soren sat on a tree and looked at the bonfire in the distance. He then turned to the shadows at the foot of the mountain and took out a piece of dried meat to chew. At this time, it was a competition of patience. The most important thing in hunting was patience. Night fell. The hunters basically did not sleep. They silently surrounded the bonfire. Their continuous failure to interrupt the ritual had made them frustrated and angry. The mixed orcs were picking their teeth with a dagger and looking behind them with hatred. Soren heard a slight noise from the vines, but before he could do anything, the high-grade gnoll sneered. It quietly lurked and slowly approached in the night. The other hunters looked at each other but did not move. Instead, they slightly raised their voices. An elven guard lurked out. The vines seemed to be controlled and did not attack him. After he left the range of the vines, he quietly sneaked out. It seemed that he was a ranger. The people in the vines were obviously watching him nervously. Soren's dark vision was already in effect. Night was not much different today for him. The shadow dancer was an advanced profession that was very suitable for night activities. Swoosh! Just when the elven guard thought that he had escaped and wanted to speed up to report, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from behind the bushes. With a flash of cold light, the gnoll's sharp claws directly pierced into the elven guard's abdomen. The gnoll grabbed the elven guard's neck with its palm and then lifted him up. When the gnoll pulled out its right claw, blood and intestines spilled out. A terrible scream was heard. The vines were strangely silent, and then someone's angry roar was heard. The gnoll picked up the elven guard with a grim smile and then walked towards the bonfire. Two strong mixed-blood orcs stood up and looked at each other fiercely. Then, a cruel smile appeared on their faces. They directly skewered the elven guard, who was still alive, with wooden sticks, and then roasted him on the bonfire. An extremely miserable wail rang out. The face of the elven nobles in the vines was as white as a sheet of paper. The remaining elven guards were also pale. Soren put down the jerky. He suddenly felt that he really did not have much of an appetite. He silently put away the dry food. The faint screams were still intermittently heard. He held his curved sword tightly and stayed where he was. He looked up at the sky. It was still early. The time before dawn was the time when people were the most relaxed. Even high-grade professions would feel a little tired during this time. The screams from the bonfire were getting weaker and weaker. Soren looked over there expressionlessly. His hand holding the curved sword was a little pale because he used too much strength. There was a smell of meat in the air. But when the smell drifted out, the elven nobles in the vines suddenly vomited. He vomited until tears and snot came out. He looked very embarrassed. The hunters laughed ferociously. The mixed-blood orcs picked up the corpse, tore off a leg, and threw it into the vines. They also said something loudly, which seemed to mean that the roasted meat was delicious and they could eat it now. One of the elven guards wanted to rush out as if he had gone crazy, but he was stopped by another person. Because going out would be suicide. The elven nobles were completely paralyzed on the spot. His expression was a little nervous because the roasted leg was thrown in front of him. As a noble, he had probably never experienced something like this. This was the real survival in the wilderness. Soren was very quiet. His figure was invisible in the darkness. He kept paying attention to the bonfire and occasionally looked up at the sky. It was almost dawn. The elves in the vines were almost on the verge of collapse. The hunters' methods were not something these pampered fellows could withstand. Some of the mixed-blood orcs were sleeping, but some were on guard. Night. The high-ranking jackalin's eyes were green, and it had been watching the nearby movements. However, as time passed, it also gently closed its eyes. They had been surrounding this place for almost 3 days, and it also needed a little rest. The power of magic was declining. They found that some of the vines had withered. It would not take long for these damn vines to disappear. Soren watched silently. Although the high-tier jackalin had closed its eyes, it was still squatting on the ground. It could rush out in an instant. It was not asleep. It just closed its eyes and took a nap. Time passed by minute. Some of the mixed-blood orcs were already snoring. The vigilant hunters looked slightly tired. The gnoll's posture was also slightly tilted. Soren's expressionless face finally showed a trace of emotion. He narrowed his eyes slightly, pulled out his curved sword, and then slowly approached in an arc bit by bit, he got closer. Chapter 128. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Night was the best cover for a rogue. Soren couldn't see any traces under the moonlight. Even when he moved, he only left very faint footprints. Perfect stealth required a combination of spells and spell-like abilities. In addition to greater invisibility, it also required a combination of greater lighten, greater haste, and so on. Soren didn't meet such conditions for the time being, but with his strength, he wouldn't be easily discovered by the enemy. It was already the time before dawn. The vigilant hunters were a little relaxed and narrowed the range of their vigilance. 200 meters, 150 meters, 100 meters. When Soren closed the distance to about 80 or 90 meters, he slowly stopped. Then his figure strangely disappeared. He didn't hide in the shadows, but activated shadow jump and directly crossed into the shadow plane. The scenery in front of him was still gray. Even at night, the moonlight was gray. The shadow plane seemed to be unchanging and dead. A short second, but it left a very deep impression. The next moment, the shadow of the high-grade knoll twisted. The dancing bonfire in front of it made its shadow look like an evil spirit with fangs and claws. Then it turned into a hazy figure. At the same time, a curved sword with a cold light pierced its back. The white scales on the blade reflected light. The moment it pierced the heart of the high-grade knoll, it also alarmed the other hunters. A row of data appeared in front of Soren. Activated dark vision. Activated shadow jump. Activated shadow strike. Shadow jump successful. Activated shadow jump crossplane ability. Shadow strike successful. You've received 9 shadow damage. Activated backstab. You've dealt 154 piercing damage to the target. Everything happened in an instant. The hunters who were awakened by the sword rushed over. When the high-grade knoll opened its eyes, there was already a curved sword in its chest, directly piercing its heart. However, it didn't die immediately. On the contrary, a blood-red light appeared in its eyes. It roared crazily as all the muscles on its body swelled up. It swung its claws at Soren's throat. Soren's face was sliced open by the sharp claws, but it only left a shallow cut. Soren had already retreated the moment his claws landed on his enemy. The scimitar was pulled out on the spot. Blood gushed out like a fountain, and the figure of the high-ranking jackalin stiffened for a moment. Then, with a roar, it rushed over. It looked like it wanted to die together with him. Soren didn't stop at all. Even if he couldn't kill the enemy in one hit, he quickly disappeared into the shadows and activated evade sight. Soren entered stealth. The high-grade knoll seemed to have gone crazy. It attacked everything in front of it. A mixed-blood orc who rushed too close was directly cut open by its claws. There was a slight commotion around the campfire. The other hunters looked at the blood gushing out of the knoll's chest and couldn't do anything. No one even dared to get too close to it. It was obvious that the knoll had gone crazy. The nearby bushes and trees were cut down by its claws. The high-grade knoll's blood-red eyes searched for its enemy's target. Its chest was completely covered in blood. Rewind time to 1 second ago. When Soren's sword hit the knoll, there was no kill notification in front of his eyes. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately gave up on the idea of killing it and quickly retreated. High fortitude? Or legendary fortitude? Soren felt a slight pain on the side of his face. He knew that the enemy's claws had scratched his face. After distancing himself for about 10 meters, he immediately activated, evade sight, and disappeared into the shadows. As a veteran adventurer, Soren was sure that he had stabbed the knoll's heart. If the knoll's heart didn't trigger the test of lethal damage, then there could only be one result. The knoll had high fortitude, or even legendary fortitude. It was a purebred melee profession that was close to level 18. Its physical strength was close to supernatural. The distance between them was about 50 meters. All the hunters had woken up. They looked around with vigilance and uneasiness. The high-grade knoll was still standing on the ground. Its crazy and bloodthirsty eyes were trying to find Soren's trace. A lot of blood was gushing out of its chest. Some people tried to get close to it and heal it. However, without the divine spells of a high-grade priest, it was impossible to heal such a serious injury by relying on medicine alone. More and more blood gushed out. The high-grade knoll's feet were covered in blood. Its eyes were getting crazier and weaker. Finally, after being stabbed in the heart by Soren, it still held on for 5 or 6 minutes. Only then did the knoll's blood run dry. It fell to the ground with a roar full of unwillingness. A notification appeared in front of him, target killed. Extracting soul energy. You've received 5200 slaughter EXP. Soren returned to the shadows. He wandered around the hunters and looked at the high-grade knoll on the ground in front of him. He was surprised. What a high fortitude. In his memory, other than those legendary realm warriors, there were only a few creatures that could counterattack after their hearts were pierced. Perhaps only a few creatures with abnormal vitality could do so. The high-grade knoll that was just listed as the first target didn't trigger the test of lethal damage when its heart was stabbed. It probably didn't have many fatal points on its body. If he wanted to kill it in one blow, he could only use a beheading attack unless he pierced the brain. High-grade melee professions could train to have extremely high fortitude. Soren had seen a legendary melee profession with legendary fortitude and absolute fortitude. After his heart was taken out, he still fought for nearly 10 minutes. He relied on his explosive power to kill a large number of enemies at the last moment of his life. If a high-grade priest could cast a level 9, Greater Restoration, spell on him during this period of time, then his heart could be restored by divine spells. The profession level of the high-grade knoll was close to 18, and its HP was estimated to be close to 300 points. Soren's attack didn't trigger the test of lethal damage, so it only caused about 150 points of damage to it. Although it didn't kill it on the spot, the bleeding damage and the damage to its internal organs caused its HP to continuously decrease. Even with the high vitality of a high-grade warrior, it couldn't last long under such serious bleeding and internal injuries. The god of the hunt had already taken back the divine spells it gave. Without a priest with a profession level of 15 or above to cast restoration, even if it was seriously injured, it could only last a little longer. Its vitality was rapidly depleting, and eventually, its HP was completely exhausted. Although Soren killed the most dangerous high-grade knoll among the hunters, he didn't feel much excitement in his heart because the strength of the enemies in front of him was beyond his estimation. He simply didn't have the ability to kill all of them. In this attack, these enemies had already been alerted. They shortened the distance between each other and expanded their vigilance range at the same time, basically cutting off his chance of a sneak attack. Shadow Jump had already been activated. Without this supernatural ability to cross planes, it would be very difficult for him to sneak over and backstab them. If he killed an enemy, he would be surrounded by other hunters. However, Soren didn't just leave. He was a very patient rogue, and his killing intent towards the enemies in front of him was firm enough. He once again lurked around, silently waiting for a new opportunity. As long as these hunters continued to hold the ritual, he could wait for a new opportunity. For Soren, who had already surpassed grade 3, this kind of opportunity was enough for him to kill an enemy. The light of dawn gradually emerged. The hunters didn't dare to act rashly. To deal with a rogue who was proficient in stealth, acting rashly would only expose them to danger. They were waiting for dawn, and only after dawn would they be able to find traces of the rogue. The mixed-blood orc was angrily cursing, as if roaring that it would pull out the tendons and skin the enemy when it found them. But now it was still very dark. No matter how angry it was, this guy didn't dare to be more than 15 steps away from the others. As long as it went beyond this distance, it was likely to be attacked by a high-grade rogue because there were too many shadows nearby. The light in the sky was getting brighter and brighter. Soren increased the distance to more than 200 meters. Because with the arrival of the day, his stealth ability was also weakened, and this group of hunters was likely to disperse into small groups to find his trace. A rogue absolutely couldn't fight against more than 3 enemies with a similar profession level. Suddenly, just as Soren was about to continue to increase the distance, the hunters in front of him let out an excited roar, and then saw them rushing to the foot of the mountain. There were a lot of vines growing there, but now they began to wither in large patches. The power contained in them had been exhausted, and these vines, which were born from the mysterious power, quickly died. A loud eagle cry sounded. The hunters' movements were a little slower. Soren also looked up at the sky, and he saw the figure of Droll. There were cries of joy coming from the vines. After 3 days, finally Droll found them. The mixed-blood orc roared, and then without hesitation, they rushed to the vines. They wanted to kill the target before Droll got close. Swoosh! A sharp arrow shot at the mixed-blood orc at the front, and then a vigorous figure jumped directly from a height of hundreds of meters. It was a very beautiful and tall female elf. There was a crescent moon emblem on her exquisite armor. This emblem made everyone's face change. Soren also stopped. His expression was a little hesitant, and then he took a deep breath and suddenly rushed into the vines in stealth. A shadow flew out. He knocked out the elven nobleman in the vines with a swing of his hand, and then quickly searched around. Chapter 129. The Knight in Silver. When he saw the figure falling from the sky, Soren realized that the identity of the elven noble was more complicated than he thought. To be able to make a quasi-legendary profession who served the Lady of the Silver Moon come to save him, he probably had the blood of the elven royal family. So Soren made a very bold decision in an instant, and that was to rob the other party. The elven noble must have a legendary item on him, otherwise, the mutated vines would not have been able to stop the hunters for 3 days. Soren's speed was extremely fast. As an experienced thief, after knocking the elven noble unconscious, he quickly took out a multidimensional bag from the noble's body, as well as a leaf that looked green and lustrous. However, it seemed to be something extraordinary that was kept close to the noble's body. After Soren got these 2 things, he wanted to escape, but suddenly a cold light flew from a distance. Swoosh! Soren let out a scream. The hand holding the multidimensional bag was shot by a sharp arrow, and half of the arrow penetrated his palm. The multidimensional bag fell directly to the ground. The arrow's angle was very tricky, and at the moment he was shot, he was unable to hold on to the bag. In the distance, the knight in silver dodged the attack of the mixed-blood orc, and then with a cold expression, she put an arrow on her bow and aimed at Soren again. As a quasi-legendary profession, the knight in silver had the combat ability of a ranger, and could also use the high-level divine spells of a priest. It was an advanced profession that was naturally close to the legendary level. A droll's figure fell from the sky. At the moment when the elven longbow was aimed at him, Soren's back also had goosebumps. He did not hesitate to pick up the unconscious elven noble, and then directly put him in front of himself. The knight in silver's expression was indeed hesitant. She twisted her body and shot a hunter in the arm, and then sprinted towards Soren's position. The speed of the opponent's sprint was very amazing, almost leaving behind afterimages. It was simply a supernatural ability. Soren took a deep breath and did not bother to pick up the multidimensional bag on the ground. He quickly put the strange green leaf into his arms. Then, he gritted his teeth and threw the elven noble in his hand away. Then, he flew towards the shadows. The knight in silver hesitated for a moment, but still reached out to catch the elven noble. After checking his breath and finding that he had just fainted, she suddenly raised her longbow to block an attack from behind. She seemed to want to keep Soren here, but he was nowhere to be seen. Evade sight. As soon as Soren entered the shadows, he activated evade sight for the last time. After entering stealth, he quickly retreated without looking back. The droll who had just landed was also a high-tier spellcaster. The knight in silver's skill was superb. She could even shoot an arrow while blocking the opponent's attack. Her slender figure seemed to be dancing in a strange way, and any attack missed her by a little bit. This was a very clever dodging skill, which was close to the legendary dodge ability. She alone blocked 5 or 6 hunters. The roar of a wild beast resounded. After the droll landed, the weeds on the ground began to grow wildly, blocking the hunters who rushed in front of him for more than 10 seconds. Then, a huge brown bear appeared out of thin air. It roared and pounced forward, raising its bare claws. A mixed-blood orc with more than 20 points of strength was slapped until he spat out blood. There was a hideous claw mark on his chest, and all his ribs were caved in. The ferocious brown bear let out a low roar. It weighed more than a ton, and under its tough fur was a thick layer of fat and muscle. After being scratched by the hunters, it seemed to be completely fine. This was a brown bear with a monster level of more than 15. It might be an animal companion cultivated by the wild droll. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Soren's figure leaped in the dense forest. After more than a kilometer away, he stopped for a moment. He gritted his teeth and broke the arrow in his palm, then pulled out the arrowhead that penetrated his palm little by little. A hole was directly shot in his palm. If he was shot in other parts, he was afraid that it would have gone through his body. The knights in silver who served the Lady of the Silver Moon were very difficult to deal with. They were similar to the existence of the low-grade chosen and had additional power given by the gods. The Lady of the Silver Moon's faith was spread across many races, and the elves were also one of her main sources of believers. His palm trembled slightly. Soren gritted his teeth and applied some potions, then sneaked forward again. A knight in silver and a high-grade droll, it would not be easy for the hunters to kill the elven noble. The strength of the two sides was not much different because most of the people who could advance into the knights in silver were professions with a total level of 18 or above. Even if they had not entered the realm of legends, they would not be too far away. Soren must take advantage of the time to open up enough distance and then find a way to completely get rid of the other party. The knights in silver had the ability of a ranger, and they were not much worse than a rogue in tracking. Soren fled all the way. After opening up a distance of more than 20 kilometers, he took a little rest and took out the strange green leaf. If this was not a legendary equipment, it would not be worth it for him to take such a big risk to grab it. The knights in silver were famous for being vengeful. Most of them were female elves with a long lifespan and a good memory. Offending them was easy to get revenge and be hunted down for a long time. Soren tried to identify the item, but a row of data unexpectedly appeared. Appraisal failed. Do you want to use soul energy to identify the item? Appraisal will cost 3,000 soul energy. How is this possible? There was a hint of shock on Soren's face, followed by a pleasantly surprised expression. He had successfully appraised the legendary item, elemental stone, earth, in an instant, but the green leaf in front of him actually failed. Moreover, it required a full 3,000 slaughter EXP to appraise. This was something that had never happened before in his memory. Could it be that the leaf he had grabbed had exceeded the level of a legendary item? That was impossible. Above the legendary level was a divine artifact. A divine artifact could not be carried around by an elven noble, and the restrictions of a divine artifact were great. There was a force field of law energy on it, so it was impossible for him to hold it in his hand casually. Because most of the divine artifacts would be damaged if you held them indiscriminately. It was possible that you would be seriously injured to the point of near death. Even a legendary thief would have to activate omnipotent hands before he dared to touch them. Pay slaughter EXP, although he did not know what the green leaf in his hand was, Soren did not hesitate to choose to spend soul energy. He felt that the leaf in front of him was definitely not simple. An emerald green light appeared. As if a strong burst of vitality, the wound on Soren's palm healed at an amazing speed. In the blink of an eye, the bloody hole in his palm completely disappeared, and the wound left by the arrow had been completely healed. Then a row of data appeared: item type, leaf of life, unknown. Item grade, elven holy object. Item description, a leaf inherited from the mythological era. It came from an unknown ancient existence. It contains a strong vitality, but a part of its power has been used. Requirements, none. Effects, heal heavy wounds, 1 time per day, bark spell, 3 times per day, elven plant revival, 0 to 1. Effect, permanently increases physique by 1 point, HP by 10 points, and gains the ability of regeneration. Note, this item cannot increase physique to 25 points or more. Elven holy object? When Soren saw the first part of the divine artifact, his expression was still calm, but when he saw the final effects, he was very surprised. Because he had a very rare item in his hand that could permanently increase attributes. There were too few items in this world that could increase one's attributes, and even fewer items that could continue to increase one's extraordinary attributes. Although there were some extremely rare items that could increase one's attributes to around 20 points, the number of items that could increase one's extraordinary attributes beyond 20 points could be counted on one's fingers. A faint light of magic appeared. Soren's expression suddenly changed. After putting away the leaf of life, he quickly ran forward. Someone had used a spell to locate this item. But all items above the legendary level would have some special energy. Their past owners could use spells to locate the target. Among them, artifacts and high-grade legendary items had special marks on them. Artifacts were the easiest to locate with spells, and sometimes even the gods were interested in them. Soren hesitated for a moment. Then he took out the leaf of life again, stuffed it into his mouth without saying a word, and swallowed it directly. I don't believe you can use spells to locate me after eating it. At the foot of the mountain, Droll looked at the elven nobleman in front of him with a gloomy face. The hunters had retreated. They were not sure if they could kill a powerful knight in silver and a high-grade droll. Slap! The light of the magic in Droll's hand dissipated. With a cold expression, he slapped the elven nobleman in the face and said in a deep voice, "The leaf of life has been used. You dare to sneak it out? Come back with me to see His Excellency Droll." The tall figure of the knight in silver walked to a pool of blood. She picked up the blood-stained soil and smelled it. Then she turned around and said, "Do you want me to track that guy?" Droll bowed slightly to show his respect and said slowly, "If you can, please bring him back. The energy of the leaf of life is still in his body." Chapter 130. A strong burst of vitality. Soren's mouth was slightly bitter, as if he had just chewed a leaf. But he did eat a leaf, and it was accompanied by a very strong vitality. It was difficult to describe the feeling in words, but the effect was very powerful. His constitution was increased to 21 points, and he permanently gained an additional 10 points of HP. Now his HP was 146 points, and his vitality was not much different from a level 12 purebred warrior. After all, a warrior's basic HP was 10 points, and a rogue only had 6 points. A row of data appeared in front of him. Use, Leaf of Life. You have permanently increased your constitution by 1 point. You have permanently increased your HP by 10 points. Regeneration, Beginner, has been upgraded to Intermediate. Even the regeneration ability has been upgraded? Soren looked at his ability data in surprise. He found that the regeneration ability, which originally required 25 constitution to upgrade, had been upgraded once. Regeneration, intermediate, gifted ability. Your strong constitution has exceeded the scope of mortals. Many injuries are no longer fatal to you. Your strong vitality has allowed you to regenerate like a troll. You can gradually recover from any serious injury and below over time. Some of the limb injuries can also be self-recovered. Although you can't regrow an arm or a head like a troll, as your constitution gradually increases, you will be able to do this one day. Regeneration speed per hour +2, powerful regeneration ability. Soren looked at his ability data, and his expression was a little excited. He murmured, according to the current regeneration effect, I can regenerate 48 HP in 24 hours, which is close to 1/3 of my HP. That is to say, I can recover from a serious injury to a light injury in a day. If it wasn't for the near-death state of a limb injury, I could also recover in 3 days. Regeneration was the most powerful survival ability. Soren had dealt with an enemy with advanced regeneration in the past. This guy just needed to find a place to hide for a day, and when he reappeared the next day, he was fully recovered. If he couldn't kill him in one breath, there was no way to deal with him. Even a heavily wounded healer could only recover around 50 HP. It took time for priests to memorize divine spells, and the number of divine spells they could memorize in a day was actually not that many. If you were to face enemies with strong regenerative abilities, especially creatures like vampires, you would find that they were like priests. The most perverted ones were vampires who were born with a higher grade. They had the advanced regeneration ability and could even restore their HP by sucking blood. A challenge rating of 15 was no joke. The dark creatures of this world were hard to deal with, and supernatural abilities were nothing out of the ordinary for them. Soren continued heading north. Although he had eaten the leaf of life, he couldn't rule out the possibility that the other party would continue to track him down. This kind of extremely rare item had not been used by anyone until now. It either had a very special religious significance, or it might have other special uses. It could increase one's constitution by 1 point, increase one's HP by 10, and obtain an additional regeneration ability. It was very tempting even for legendary professions. That elven nobleman definitely had royal blood in him. If Soren ate this thing, it would be a small matter if he was hung up and beaten. A day passed quickly. Soren didn't know how far he had walked. Anyway, he ran at high speed all the way and tried to sneak in places with shadows. This was a very good ability for rogues. Invisibility had a duration, but a rogue's stealth ability was always effective. If they were bored, they could stay in stealth for a whole day. In the beginning, there were people who transformed themselves into shadow beings, and their stealth ability could be said to have been further improved. If they entered the higher realm of legends, which was roughly around rogue profession level 25, they could also become permanently invisible through special rituals. Although this ability was powerful, it was very difficult to communicate. Soren conservatively estimated that he had walked more than 200 kilometers in a day. Along the way, he encountered many villages and a large elven town. There were not many cities on the elven side. There were only 5 or 6 in total, distributed in some very important places. This was a bit like the city-state system. Many places relied on cities for survival. Under normal circumstances, there would not be other large cities within 100 kilometers of a city. The area of the southern region was about 1/3 of Asia's, but there were less than 200 or 300 cities. And they were mainly concentrated in the plains near the river. If it was close to the desert and the virgin forest, the distribution of cities would be even more sparse. There were only 6 large cities in the entire desert area, all of which were built in the oasis area on the edge. The development of cities in this era required a lot of conditions. Amber City rose because of the diversion of the river. If there were no innate geographical conditions, it would be quite difficult to transform and develop the city by relying only on manpower. The sky gradually darkened. Soren saw some eagles on the road, and he couldn't be sure if they were the animal companions that Droll recruited from time to time. However, he was careful to avoid these creatures. When they appeared in the sky, they slowed down along the shadows. Soren didn't make a fire to cook. He just chewed dry food for a meal and then continued on his way. With his extraordinary constitution of 21, this kind of hurrying was not a big consumption. The enhanced dark vision from the shadow dancer made him more comfortable at night. If the knight in silver was really tracking him, then the best way to get away from her was at night. After all, their speed was about the same during the day, and it was certainly impossible for the knight in silver to continue tracking at night. Night was the time when wild beasts were active. Soren heard the movements of many wild beasts and saw some green eyes. He was almost at the border of the elves, and he didn't go deep into the jungle. He had been moving on the edge of the area. The possibility of encountering Droll inside the forest was very high. Many Droll liked to live in seclusion in the virgin forest. A woo! A wolf howl sounded. Soren looked at the hills in the distance. The trees nearby were much fewer. Some of the howls were louder and louder. It was the sound of a warg. He was close to the border of the orcs. Although the orcs were good at domesticating wargs and had trained elite wolf riders, there were only 1,000 or 2,000 of them in the entire tribe. This wolf rider needed hundreds of thousands of people to feed, and much of the meat came from corpses and executed criminals in the war. The orcs had reduced the number of domesticated wargs several times during this period because of the huge consumption of meat. It was estimated that this winter would continue to decrease. It was a little better to domesticate wargs. The drow's petrified lizards were the real money burners. He often saw people throwing corpses to feed them in the Underdark. After passing through this barren hilly area, he gradually approached the northern area. The barbarian fortress was on a mountain over there. It had the oldest and purest barbarian training heritage. Every year, advanced barbarians would visit. Soren had tried the training method there. Carrying boulders along the mountain path in the cold wind was definitely a torturous way of training. 3 days. Soren crossed a distance of more than 800 kilometers and approached the range of the Frost Kingdom little by little. The temperature was getting lower and lower. The ground had begun to freeze. There was a heavy frost in the morning, and the top half of the mountain in the distance was covered with ice and snow. The wild beasts here were much thicker in order to adapt to the cold climate. Soren looked travel-worn. Some beard grew on his chin, and he looked much more tired than before. But when he saw a peak like the Himalayas in the distance, a smile appeared on his face. He was finally about to reach the icebound valley. Chapter 131. The biting cold wind was like a knife. Soren had to put on a cloak to cover his whole body. This year, the north was colder than before. He didn't know if it would only last this winter. Anyway, in his memory, the Frost Kingdom was not as cold as it was now. The heavy snow had basically stopped, but the speed of ice and snow melting was very slow. There were almost no traces of melting. Ice had begun to form on all sides, and some rivers were covered with ice that people could pass through. It was now the end of September, and there were still 5 or 6 days until October. The beasts in the ice field had begun to come out to look for food. Because of the cold climate, the wolves had also begun to migrate. Soren encountered many monsters along the way, but he avoided them by using stealth. Looking from afar, the mountain was right in front of him, but when he walked, he found that it was still not there. Soren walked for half a day before he gradually approached the range of the icebound valley because there were many ice crystals on the trees around. The icebound valley was one of the coldest places. The climate here was somewhat special, and it hadn't changed for hundreds of years. Traces of carriages appeared in the wind and snow. Soren stopped to observe and found that there should be a caravan in front of him. Who would go to the Frost Kingdom in winter? Soren pushed away the snow and looked at the traces of the wheels. The big carriage should have been specially modified to widen the bearing area, but it wasn't modified into a sleigh. It didn't look like people from the south. They should have come from the port cities in the central region. The number of people in the caravan was relatively large. Soren estimated that there were at least 30 or 40 people. There shouldn't be any caravans in this season, right? Soren carefully looked in front of him, but he didn't see them. They probably passed by yesterday. Moving forward in the ice field was slow. Soren estimated that he would meet these people tonight. He just didn't know who would go north in such a cold weather. There were traces of bonfires nearby, and some pieces of food were thrown directly on the side of the road. Soren looked at the debris in front of him and frowned because he felt that it wasn't a caravan in front of him. The ice on the road was getting thicker and thicker. When the sky gradually darkened, Soren finally saw a group of people in front of him. They were 3 large, modified carriages. The pack beast was a type of yak with thick fur. Its entire body was snow-white and there was only one horn on its head. These yaks were squatting in a circle around the perimeter to block the cold wind. In front of them was an experienced team. They had obviously been to the ice plains before and knew how to make themselves more comfortable, just like how people in the desert knew how to use camels to block the wind and sand. The tamed pack beasts were very tame. Soren did not see any caravan guards, nor did he see many mounts. These people in front of him were not merchants. Who? A short figure jumped out and squinted its eyes. Soren saw a green-skinned goblin, but it was different from the other goblins he had seen before. Its facial expression was richer, and its face was smeared with strange paint. It looked like a clown. As the goblin shouted, more than a dozen people near the carriage stood up. Almost all kinds of races could be seen, and there were even beautiful elves standing next to the burly orcs. Circus? Soren frowned slightly, walked over slowly, and smiled. A traveler passing by saw you here and came to ask for a hot soup. The green-skinned goblin looked at him up and down, then showed a funny smile and waved, "Come here. We just went camping." A lone adventurer. It didn't seem to be much danger, at least not a threat to such a large caravan. Soren slowly approached, but his expression was not completely relaxed. He looked around and asked, "Circus? Are you going to the Frost Kingdom to perform?" There were 3 big carriages. 2 of them were loaded with a lot of sundries, many of which were tools for the performance. The other one was not very clear, but it looked quite gorgeous from the outside. Of course. A beautiful elf stood up. Her skin was very delicate, and she seemed to have the bloodline of a grassland elf. She was wearing an exquisite dress, which was a bit like the dress of a lady performing a dance. However, the neckline was quite wide, revealing a white and smooth chest. There was a split on the side of the dress, and there should be a button inside. If it was unbuttoned, it would reveal her white thighs. She tilted her head and looked at Soren. After thinking that he didn't look like a bad guy, she complained, "If it's not for the performance, who would want to come to this cold place?" Soren narrowed his eyes slightly, not because of the beauty of the other party, nor because of the white chest, but because of the clothes on her body. In such cold weather, she still wore so little. Although it was cold, she still looked normal. She should be an advanced professional. Don't underestimate the performers in this world, because many of them were part-time bards, especially such circuses, opera troupes, and performance troupes. The number of professionals in them could reach up to half, and most of them were quite expensive. These professionals were like celebrities in his previous life. They would be welcomed everywhere they went, and a formal performance might earn them more than adventurers risking their lives for them. Just like the Green Goblin just now, it should be a special profession that was advanced from a bard to a clown dancer. That was why it could find Soren so quickly. The distance between them was a little closer. Soren saw an emblem with a slim shadow on it. There were barriers on all sides and colorful gauze. He looked at these people in surprise and wondered, the Phantom Circus? Huh? The elf girl looked at him with a smile and said, "You've heard of us?" "I've heard of you." Soren nodded and said slowly, "You're very famous in Port Arthur. It is said that there are some very special and wonderful performances." The elf girl giggled and looked at him playfully. "Not everyone is qualified to watch those performances." Soren shrugged slightly. He didn't have much expectation for those performances. Come here. The Green Goblin gestured for him to sit next to the bonfire. It looked completely different from the goblins in the wilderness. It should be the goblins near the sand port. The goblins there used to be servants of the great arcanists. After the destruction of the Arcane Empire, they still kept part of their heritage. Their skin color was lighter than other goblins, and they didn't have a sense of identity with the goblins in the wilderness. The way they looked at the goblins in the wilderness was like how Africans looked at cannibals. When it was time to kill, they would never show mercy. My name is Copper Coin. I'm a clown. The goblin showed a funny smile and waved the food in its hand. Do you want to try? Barbecue ice frog. Only here can you eat good food. It tastes much better than other bullfrogs. Ice frog? Soren looked at the food in its hand and frowned. This seems to be poisonous, right? It will cause diarrhea after eating it. It's okay. Copper Coin shrugged and said, goblins dare to eat anything. Copper Coin likes to eat frogs. He's not afraid of being poisoned. Next to the bonfire, a group of people were sitting around. There were orcs, dwarves, elves, humans, and so on. There were more than 20 of them, and almost half of them were women. Soren glanced at them and found that most of them were advanced professionals. Among them, there was a high proportion of bards. The Phantom Circus was an organization that was active near the port. Of course, the members in front of him weren't the only ones. They should only be a part of it. Except for the two people who were talking, the others were very indifferent to Soren. They were just busy with their own things. There was a human girl wearing a doll mask with dozens of throwing knives on her waist. She looked at him provocatively from time to time. The elf girl should be one of the people in charge, if the woman who didn't show up in the carriage was not. What's your name? Why did you come to this cold place alone? The elf girl came over and sat down directly next to Soren. She had a special fragrance on her body. Soren was familiar with this smell. The priests in charge of the goddess of lust often had this smell. Soren smiled and looked at her. Soren. I'm a lone adventurer who wants to go to the Frost Kingdom. Where is your destination? The elf girl glanced at his curved sword and smiled. To Arendelle. Their princess royal is about to ascend the throne. The court steward invited us to perform. Both sides were tentatively communicating. The others didn't seem to care much, but their attention was actually on Soren. After all, he was a stranger. Arendelle? Soren's expression was a little surprised. Then he seemed to remember something and said, that place seems to be a bit special. Didn't you hear anything before you went? The elf girl smiled slyly and said playfully, heard what? We haven't heard anything. Have you heard anything about it? Soren glanced at her, shrugged gently, and said, isn't there a legend that the incarnation of the goddess of ice has descended there? The elf girl blinked and smiled. Is that so? Then I haven't seen the incarnation of the goddess. There was a crisp sound of bells in the carriage. The elf girl's expression froze, then she quickly got up and walked over. The curtain was very thick, and nothing could be seen outside. After a while, the elf girl came out again and looked at the others. The leader said to let you have a good rest and try to get out of the frozen valley tomorrow morning. By the way, your name is Soren, right? You can also camp here. If you don't have anything, I'll ask them to prepare one for you. Solon smiled and shook his head, indicating that there was no need. As the woman in the carriage spoke, the other's attitude towards him was slightly better. A group of people began to get busy, and Soren also made a simple arrangement. The cold wind outside was still very strong, and the bonfire would dim from time to time. The human girl with a mask was watching over the bonfire. As they passed by the gorgeous carriage, Soren glanced at it. He seemed to notice some special wet marks because a thin layer of ice had formed because of the cold weather. The marks were a bit like those left by snakes. Chapter 132. The night passed quietly. If you met other travelers in the wilderness, you could at least get along if you could communicate with them without any obvious hostility. Just like how Soren was willing to accept Aladdin on the road, the performers of the Phantom Circus also temporarily accepted him for a night after they felt that he wasn't dangerous. In this world, beliefs were more effective than moral constraints. Of course, the one who really spoke was the woman in the carriage who didn't show her face. She was the real core of the circus. As for why Soren was sure that it was a woman, it was mainly because of the decoration of the carriage, the faint fragrance, and a legend that he had heard before. It was said that there was a sea witch in the Phantom Circus, but no one knew what this sea witch was. Some guessed that she was a sea demon, while others guessed that she was an undersea witch. Anyway, there were a lot of random guesses, and very few people knew the real answer. The Phantom Circus's performance fee was very high. The people in front of him had to spend at least 5,000 to 6,000 Kindler coins. Among most circuses, singing and dancing troupes, and performing troupes, the Phantom Circus had a relatively good reputation. Basically, it was rare to hear of any illegal activities. Soren didn't know much about them. In the past, he paid the most attention to the most famous Dark Moon Circus. In this world, there was a powerful deity called the Lady of Silvermoon. The knight in silver that Soren met was her believer. The Dark Moon Circus was also an organization that served her, but the latter was a hidden assassin organization. They would assassinate targets that they thought were evil. They represented the dark side of the moon. They were an organization that believed in a kind deity, but their methods were cruel and merciless. Soren had fought with them before he became a legend. He lost 2 fingers to a terrifying clown dancer. Until now, he still didn't believe that those people who killed without batting an eyelid really believed in the Lady of Silvermoon. In the circus, there were often special professions that advanced. The green-skinned goblin called Copper Coin wasn't difficult for Soren to recognize his profession, but it wasn't so easy to judge the others. The only thing that could be confirmed was that many of them were part-time bards. Their acting skills were not low, and their acting skills were also quite good. When interacting with them, it was difficult to determine whether they were telling the truth or just acting in front of you. For example, that beautiful elf girl. Performance, deception, and intimidation were the 3 basic skills of the circus. Soren had trained his deception ability in the past. The drow who trained Soren had also given him a saying, "Life is like a play, it all depends on your acting skills." Even if he had 200 to 300 points in his acting skill, that was still a real power. To be honest, when Soren saw this group of people, he really missed the observation ability that he had learned in the past. The circus had people taking turns to keep watch. In the entire group, only the green-skinned goblin didn't sleep. It didn't stand guard outside the circle. It just squatted by the bonfire and roasted frogs. It didn't know how much it ate that night. Anyway, it didn't seem to be full. There was a small pile of bones the next day. It was the real core of the group. It was able to detect Soren from a distance. This clown dancer that evolved from a goblin wasn't simple. Soren didn't have much confidence in defeating it. Even a mediocre race would give birth to some outstanding talents. Soren wouldn't underestimate anyone. Under the morning sun, the circus people began to prepare breakfast. They directly melted ice and snow in a pot. The elf girl even carried a basin of hot water into the carriage. This should have been a very normal action. However, Soren still carefully looked at it. He didn't expect to find something unexpected. The water was hot when it was brought in. It was so hot that it emitted white steam. However, when the elf girl carried it out, the water in the basin was cold. He could vaguely see a strand of floating ice. In less than 5 minutes, the basin of hot water turned into ice water. Interesting. Soren's expression didn't change. He pulled out his curved sword to shave his beard. He had been rushing through the night, so his beard had grown a little. Copper came over with a bowl of hot soup. He glanced at Soren's blade. The tiny fish scales reflected the light and looked very exquisite. Good sword. He praised and handed the hot soup to Soren. The circus soon began to move. The people in the big carriage still didn't show up. The others were busy with their own things. They seemed very well trained. The burly orc carried a whip to drive the pack beast and put the other two carriages on it. He should be the circus's beast tamer. However, there were no other beasts. Perhaps it was because the weather was too cold to bring them here. A good beast tamer could tame a beast in 1 or 2 days. It was guaranteed that they would be more obedient than Droll's animal companions. The group soon began to move forward. Soren slowed down a little and prepared to follow them through the frozen valley. That place was a little strange. It would be safer with more people. It was quiet along the way. No one would be in a good mood to travel in this world of ice and snow. The elven girl was still wearing a slightly revealing dress. Her tall figure kept moving back and forth. From time to time, she would shout and command them to move forward. Looking at her footsteps on the snow, Soren estimated that her agility was more than 20 points. Because there were only shallow footprints on the ground, he didn't know what kind of special class she had advanced. From the rhythm and movements of her body, Soren judged that her reflexes and dodges were very strong. Her advanced class might be similar to the shadow dancer, but she should be a bard. The ice on the ground was getting thicker and thicker. The others gradually became nervous. After a valley appeared in front of them, they took a little rest and began to speed up. The goblin clown walked at the front of the group. He looked up at the cliffs on both sides and the top of the mountain. He said in a deep voice, "There is a possibility of encountering ice trolls here. Everyone, hurry up and pass through. Don't shout. If you are unlucky, you will be unlucky if you encounter an avalanche." There were cliffs on all sides, and the cliffs were covered with ice. The elven girl stood on the carriage and looked up at the sky. Of course, it could also be the steep top of the mountain. She seemed to have found something. It should be the ice trolls. There were many ice trolls living on the top of the mountain. If it weren't for the scarcity of food, these ice trolls would not attack travelers below the valley. Soren. The elven girl landed lightly beside him, looked at him and blinked. "It seems that you are also a knowledgeable adventurer. Since you know the legend of Arendelle, do you know why this place is called Icebound Valley? Is this a test? Or does she want to know something from me?" Soren frowned slightly, looked at her and said, "The real Icebound Valley is ahead, but it used to be called Icewind Valley a long time ago. It is said that the valley was completely frozen because of a legendary battle. The ice there is very thick. The ice will not melt all year round. The people of the Frost Kingdom don't dare to go out there. They usually trade by sea after spring. Droll once tried to remove the anomaly in front, but it seems to have failed. There is a special energy in Icebound Valley. You should be careful later. Elementals may appear in Icebound Valley in winter. Generally, no one goes there in winter." That's right. The real ice in Icebound Valley is half a meter below, and its hardness is similar to diamond. If you are interested, you can try your weapon. It is said that there is some treasure below, but no one can cut through the ice. Hearing Soren's words, the others could not help but be surprised. As they continued to move forward, the thickness of the ice became higher and higher. Almost everything in front of them was covered with a layer of ice, and the road was slightly slippery. The elven girl seemed to be very interested in what he said. She whispered a few words beside the goblin clown, and it quickly broke the ice with a dagger. Soon it dug about 50 centimeters deep, and then saw a layer of light blue ice. Clang! Its dagger pierced the ice with a crisp sound. The goblin clown moved its palm and seemed to be a little numb. Then it said, "It's really as hard as diamond. How come I've never heard of it before?" There was only a shallow mark on the light blue ice. Soren shrugged and said, "I actually heard about it, but it seems that the legend is true. Icebound Valley." The thickness of the ice on the surface was not high, about the same as other ice cubes. Below was a special layer of ice that was as hard as diamond. Rare-grade weapons could only leave a shallow mark on it. At the beginning, many people wanted to find the secret below, but no one succeeded. It was said that something was frozen below, and it might be a divine artifact. Anyway, it had been frozen for a long time. It was not until the end of the frost riot that the ice here suddenly melted. The elven girl was obviously very interested. She reached out her finger and stroked the light blue ice, then walked into the carriage and said something. Then the team continued to move forward. The others also tried it curiously and found that the hardness of the ice was really beyond imagination. This was something left behind by supernatural abilities. There seemed to be whispers in the cold wind. It might be an illusion, or it might be real. Anyway, this sound had been there for hundreds of years. The people of the Frost Kingdom thought that there was a mysterious witch living here. In the past, all the locations had been explored, and there were basically no traces of human life. So the final conclusion was that this whisper-like sound mixed in the cold wind was not the work of supernatural abilities, but the sound was caused by a special environment. In Icebound Valley, as long as the wind was strong, there would be this kind of whisper-like sound. Fortunately, the journey here was not long. If they sped up, they could walk there in half a morning. They did not encounter any monsters along the way. Soren noticed that only one of the 3 carriages had a thin layer of ice, which was the carriage where the leader of the Phantom Circus stayed. From here, they parted ways. Soren headed towards the glacial mountains near the north, while they followed the road to the sea. Arendelle was a kingdom of ice and snow near the sea. The Princess Royal, who was about to ascend the throne, seemed to be a legendary destiny sorcerer. If he didn't remember wrongly. After the mysterious disappearance of the Frost Goddess, her magic was out of control for a while, and the nearby sea was completely frozen. In the end, the Frost Riot broke out, and the Princess Royal fought against the lesser divine power, Winter Maiden. It seemed that the lesser divine of the evil alignment, the Maiden of Pain, also joined in the fun this time. Chapter 133. Soren moved forward in the cold wind. Although he was sure that the Phantom Circus he encountered had some secrets, he had little interest in getting involved. Most of the time, trouble came to him, so he had to learn to restrain his excessive curiosity. The rest of the people in the Phantom Circus were easier to deal with. The only thing that Soren couldn't see through was the elven girl and the woman in the carriage who never showed up. The thin ice on the edge of the carriage left a deep impression on Soren. The person inside seemed to have uncontrollable power. Among all the spellcasting professions, wizards were the ones who had the best control over the power of magic. Then there was the priest and the droll. Although their power came from the gods and faith, they could control it with ease. The most uncontrollable power was the talent of the warlock. This was also the reason why Gloria was worried that Vivian would cause great damage. They were going to the kingdom of Arendelle, where the Princess Royal was about to ascend the throne, was also a dangerous warlock. The more powerful and talented the warlock was, the more dangerous it would be. It would take a long time for them to learn to control their power. The person inside was definitely not a wizard. Then the possibility that she was a warlock was more than 50%, and a powerful warlock who couldn't fully control her power. In contrast, Vivian was much better at controlling her power. She almost didn't have the period of energy rampage that other warlocks had to go through. The warlock's introverted personality was caused by the early energy rampage. Sometimes they even hurt people close to them because of the uncontrollable power. Snowflakes fell from the sky. The snow wasn't very heavy, but Soren's body was still covered with a layer of snow. He shook his cloak and the snow fell to the ground. It was almost afternoon, and he passed through a dense forest covered with snow. The road ahead gradually became more spacious, which meant that he was close to the area of human activity. There weren't many goblins and kobolds in the Frost Kingdom. The climate was too cold, but there were bugbears, a creature more dangerous than gnolls. Those creatures were called goblins, but their size and appearance were very different. Maybe they really had a partial bloodline. It was very easy for subspecies to mutate. Soren walked for about 10 kilometers before he vaguely heard the sound of music. It seemed to be a sorrowful tune. He frowned and listened to it for a while before heading in the direction of the music. Camping in the wild in the Frost Kingdom was very uncomfortable because the climate was too cold. Sometimes one's body would freeze after sleeping. The temperature here was below 0 degrees all year round. Soren decided to find a human town to rest and recover, and at the same time, replenish the number of spells he had mastered. A group of people appeared in front of him. Most of them wore fur coats, which were the most important property of the Frost Kingdom's human families. Their hair was more exuberant, and their faces were a bit like Nordic people. They were not as diverse as the southern region. In this world, people with black eyes and black hair were very common. There were also elves. Some of the incarnations of the gods looked like this, but the people in the northern part of the continental shelf tended to have European characteristics. If it was near the desert, the characteristics of the people were more obvious. Experienced people could rely on this to judge where the other party came from. Soren had obvious southern characteristics. His hair was black and flaxen, and his pupils were close to black-brown. Part of it was the human bloodline, and the other part was the characteristics of the elven bloodline. So when the group saw Soren, they recognized that he was not a native of the Frost Kingdom, but an adventurer from outside. An old northerner came out. He looked at Soren and said slowly, "Outsider. Where are you going?" "Recently, outsiders are not very welcome here." Soren leaned over slightly and glanced at the bodies in the crowd. They were holding a funeral and replied, "I'm a traveling adventurer. I want to stay in a nearby town for a while." He glanced at the center. There were 3 bodies on the ground, all of which were adult men. He could not help but frown slightly and said slowly, "May their souls rest in peace. I would like to ask what exactly happened. Why do you not welcome outsiders? Something must have happened. 3 adult men would not die suddenly." Looking at the scale of their funeral, the dead people had some status. The old man hesitated for a moment, then looked at the others and said slowly, "Recently, a group of evil fallen people have entered the Frost Kingdom. There is a terrible witch among them. She used magic to confuse many people. Many people have been killed. Our town is also threatened. The sheriff has closed the town and now outsiders are not allowed to come close. Maybe you can try somewhere else." Soren frowned and took a step forward. A strong man stepped forward and put his hand on his weapon. The old man waved his hand to stop them. His rich experience told him that solo adventurers were not easy to deal with, so there was no need to provoke them directly. That was why he politely refused. Otherwise, he could have just asked someone to expel him. There had been a series of deaths in the town, and outsiders had been rejected. Soren seemed to see something. He turned his head and said, "Can I see these bodies? Perhaps I can be of help." The old man hesitated for a moment, then nodded gently. Some of the others obviously wanted to say something. They did not seem to agree with such a desecration of the dead. The funeral had already begun, but they were stopped by the old man. "Excuse me." Soren pushed through the crowd in front of him and saw a woman with red eyes. She was holding 2 children and standing next to her. She had lost the pillar of her family, so her future would be very difficult. If she did not have a rich family property, then she could only remarry. Otherwise, it would be difficult for a woman to raise 2 children. Soren noticed that there was a scar on the neck of the corpse. He opened the eyes of the deceased and pressed his finger on the forehead of the corpse. The 3 corpses were a little similar. They were all adult and strong men. Their expressions were a little strange and twisted. It seemed that they were in great pain before they died, but there was a strange smile in the pain. There was a kindler on their lips. This was a tradition close to the north. In their legends, there was a god of death who liked wealth very much. The coins on their lips were a tribute to them. The rich put a kindler, the commoners put a silver dural, and the poor put a copper dural. The tradition in the north believed that the souls of the dead were first collected by the god of death, and then it was up to them to decide whether these souls would return to the kingdom of the gods or enter the river Styx. The first recipient of the souls must be the god of death. They were born with great power. The god of death was one of the few divine systems that had a greater divine power. The ancient god of death, the king of the dead, the king of the end of all things, and the recorder of death, still existed in a corner of the river Styx. He used to be the master of the underworld, although now he had retired. This powerful ancient god of death was the only ancient god who had a greater divine power in the past and had not fallen. He had existed for a long time, and it was said that he had been waiting for the end of all things. He waited for the end of the universe, recorded the final death, and completed his final mission. Regarding the greater divine power of the master level, he was also the only standard that could be clearly measured. This was because he personally separated his power and gave the divine title of death to 3 gods. This ancient god of death, who was regarded as the standard of a greater divine power, divided his divine power to create 3 greater divine power, gods of death, and also separated the divine title of the god of death that covered the multiverse. How strong was this ancient god of death? The information collected by Soren was not very clear. The only thing he could know was that there was a period of turmoil in the past, but it only affected the heavens and did not affect the abyss and hell. The scope of the turmoil was also very small. It was only concentrated in the material plane, and it did not affect the elemental gods and some of the ancient gods. It was a period of small-scale turmoil. During this period, the 3 gods of death joined forces to fight against nearly half of the gods in the upper plane. Although they failed in the end, the consequences had been affecting them until now. The template of the son of slaughter was said to be the descendant of the god of slaughter, one of the 3 gods of death. And it was not the direct bloodline. A lot of information had been lost, especially after the rise of the Arcane Empire. There was a very long gap in time, and there was a blank period of more than 3,000 years in the literature record. Soren remembered that there was a period of conspiracy theories that were very popular. This was because the destruction of the Arcane Empire and the disappearance of the greater divine power at the same time. After the destruction of the Arcane Empire, there was no greater divine power. Some people speculated that in this struggle, one of the greater divine powers lost, and so did the Arcane Empire. Only the gods in the heavens still existed. Otherwise, there was no way to explain why the Arcane Empire would study the elemental annihilation matter and such a terrible existence as the neutron star golem. Moreover, the last small-scale turmoil was because the greater divine power gods forcibly took away the divine titles of the other gods in the heavens. Conspiracy theorists thought that this was enough to make the other gods have the idea of rebelling and even killing the greater divine power gods. They also listed some of the information that the Arcane Empire had the ability to help kill the greater divine power, because someone had been to the Nirvana mechanical mirror, challenge rating 25. The conspiracy theorists also tried to speculate the truth of this turbulent period. Unfortunately, there was no useful information because this time, not only the gods in the heavens, but also the ancient gods in the abyss, hell, and the elemental plane had all lost the power of divinity. This time, it was obviously not something that a greater divine power could do, because this time, none of the gods were spared. It was said that the ancient god of death, who had given up most of his divine power, was beaten down. Soren lifted the clothes on the body, and this action made the others angry. Some even wanted to attack him because he directly took off the clothes of the dead body. Clang! Soren pulled out his curved sword and pointed it at the people who wanted to attack, and they could not help but take a step back. He frowned and looked at the wounds on the body, which were covered with hideous and shocking wounds. Soren's face was gloomy. He used his fingers to separate the broken flesh and murmured, "Snake whip." Chapter 134. Snake Head Whip. The most vicious special weapon in the Underdark could only be used by those who had trained in special abilities. Most of them were priests of the Queen of Spiders. They used this weapon to torture the enemy and make the enemy feel extreme physical pain. The only other person who could use this weapon was the Maiden of Pain, who was in charge of torture, pain, torture, and so on. In the past 100 or 200 years, she had been involved in the pleasure of abuse and wanted to use it to extend the divine domain of pleasure, lust, taboo, and so on. If she succeeded, She could deprive the divine domain of sex and abuse in lust and supplement it with the divine domain of pain and torture. Eventually, it would become a springboard for seizing the divine domains of lust, pleasure, reproduction, sex, and so on. She didn't necessarily need to be the main god of the whole world. Even if it was just the sex and abuse god that the drows believed in, she could use it to touch the divine domain of lust. It was impossible for the gods to expand their divine domain for no reason. The power of these divine domains extended mutually. For example, the core divine domain of the Queen of Spiders was the god of the drows. All the domains related to the drows were included in this divine domain. Below this divine domain, there were other extended divine domains of the Queen of Spiders, such as spiders, evil, darkness, murder, and so on. Many gods would extend their domain of divinity to completely absorb the power of their opponents before killing them. The Frost Kingdom is not safe anymore. This was the first thought in Soren's mind. His original plan was to bring Vivian here to avoid the coming time of troubles. But now everything in front of him told him that although the time of troubles did not affect this place on a large scale, the chaos of ice and snow had begun to ferment. Everything in front of him was definitely related to the Maiden of Pain, but it was not until 2 or 3 years later that it completely broke out. Before that, it was clear that her believers had been active in the Frost Kingdom. No place was safe. Soren felt that the corpse in front of him seemed to be mocking him, mocking his timidity and escape. He tried his best to bring Vivian here to avoid the time of troubles. But now it was like being slapped in the face, telling him in a cold and ruthless tone that there was no real safe place in this era. Even the Frost Kingdom, which he thought had not been affected by the time of troubles, began to brew the coming storm of slaughter. Haha. Soren's expression was a little ferocious, revealing a psychotic smile. He slowly withdrew his scimitar, looked up at the sky, and murmured, "God. Are you forcing me to do this?" There was nowhere to run. If the believers of the Maiden of Pain really came here, then the Frost Kingdom would not be as safe as imagined. It took Soren almost a month to travel from Amber City to Whiterun. He cleared out all the monsters in his way, crossed the plains, and arrived at Autumnfall. From there, he entered the Elven Kingdom, crossed the Forest of Dreams, and fought against the hunters. After that, he crossed the barren plains and entered the frigid north. How much blood had he lost along the way? How many times had he fought? However, everything in front of him was like a loud slap to his face, telling him that his actions over the past month were laughable. He ran away like a clown, but in the end, he couldn't escape anything. Soren's back was covered with scars, left by the gnolls and the ogres. He only wanted to take Vivian away from danger and find a relatively safe place to avoid the time of troubles. However, the scene in front of him seemed to have whipped his heart with a snakehead whip. While the pain penetrated his bone marrow, it also suddenly woke him up. He couldn't escape, no matter where he went. Even the most peaceful Frost Kingdom had begun to brew a storm. There was no real safe place in the world. There was only battle. There was only battle left. Soren's palm clenched the scimitar, and his fingers turned white because of excessive force. He glanced coldly at the others around him. His cold gaze was like a blade, making the others retreat far away at once. It was a kind of killing intent that made them feel cold all over when they were stared at by Soren. Since they couldn't escape. Then let's fight. For Vivian, and for himself, he had to fight his way out of this world. He had already fled for thousands of kilometers, almost across half of the continent, but the bloody reality woke him up. There were some things that he had to face no matter how hard he tried. As long as he was still alive in this world, he couldn't escape. Stop. A steady female voice suddenly sounded, and then a middle-aged woman with an amiable face walked over accompanied by 2 young girls. She frowned and glanced at Soren, then glanced at the others and slowly said, "What are you doing? All of you, put away your weapons." This middle-aged woman seemed to have a very high status. After seeing her, the others couldn't help but bow slightly. Those who pulled out their weapons because of Soren's actions also hesitated for a moment and put them away. This was the town's priest, and a priest of the goddess of agriculture. Any gods that were closely related to their lives would be respected by the people. The priest of the goddess of agriculture had a very high status in society. This was because anything related to food would be taken more seriously. Soren's emotional fluctuations only lasted for a moment, then he bowed slightly to apologize and said slowly, "I'm sorry. I was a little emotional." The middle-aged woman looked at him deeply. Her face was quite graceful and amiable, full of a maternal aura. This was the power of the god she served. The goddess of agriculture was the daughter of Mother Gaia. After Mother Gaia retired, the goddess of agriculture took over the divine position of Mother Gaia. She was also the only god who didn't have a divine position of battle but had the peak of great divine power. The goddess of agriculture's divine power level was similar to that of the elven main god. Under her were the river goddess, the mountain goddess, the lake goddess, and other gods. It was a special divine system independent of nature, and it was the connection point between the natural divine system and the human divine system. This was because the goddess of agriculture's father was the god of light. The god of light was the previous light of dawn, the god that the young priest in Amber City worshipped. He was the partner of Mother Gaia and had a very close relationship with her. Although Mother Gaia had many interactions with gods in her long life, the light of dawn was her most important partner. Everything grew because of the sun, and Mother Gaia gave birth to the goddess of agriculture. She gave the divine position of agriculture to her daughter and helped her become a new god. The god of light was her most reliable ally, and the power of light protected the field of agriculture. In just a few thousand years, the goddess of agriculture did not kill any gods, nor did she start any wars. She relied on the expansion of faith all the way from a weak divine power to a great divine power, and became one of the most powerful gods in the whole world. The believers of the goddess of agriculture were all over the farming races, and her temples could be seen almost everywhere. Even some evil species would hold a sacrificial ceremony at a fixed time every year. The divine position of agriculture produced too many fields, and the power it possessed was very strong. It was almost the foundation of the whole world's development. Therefore, the priests of the goddess of agriculture were respected in human society, especially among the lower-class civilians. This was because agriculture was what they relied on to survive, and whether they lived well depended on the harvest in the fields. Relax, child. The middle-aged woman reached out and touched Soren's forehead. Although he was a little resistant, he did not avoid it. A gentle force flowed into his body and gradually calmed his emotions. This was the mother power of the earth, and the goddess of agriculture inherited part of the mother power of the earth. This force calmed Soren down a little, and his hand that was holding the curved sword gently loosened. The goddess of agriculture advocated better development of agriculture, and more food harvest to reduce conflicts and wars between races. This was a neutral and kind god, and he was also the god who had the least desire to fight. Evil species rarely sacrificed to good gods, but the goddess of agriculture was an exception. She still had some believers in the evil camp. It seemed that she also tolerated these believers. She was different from the god of light, who could not tolerate sand in his eyes. The goddess of agriculture strictly adhered to the rules of neutrality and kindness, but she tried her best to tolerate everything. Very good. The middle-aged woman smiled and said slowly, "Can you tell me what you know? This group of evil guys has caused a lot of panic recently, and we all hope to find them." Soren let out a long breath, then bowed slightly and said, "It seems that they are the believers and followers of the Maiden of Pain. The weapon that killed them was a snake-headed whip. This weapon is very rare on the ground. In the Underdark, only the priests of the Queen of Spiders and the followers of the Maiden of Pain can use it." The Maiden of Pain? The middle-aged woman frowned. Although the god in charge of torture, pain, and whipping was not powerful, she was not easy to deal with at all. For a long time. Some gods could not avoid falling, but this god, who was only a low-level god, lived longer than many mid-level evil gods. This was not just because of power. The clergy of pain and torture belonged to the field of battle. Although there were not many believers of the Maiden of Pain, their combat power was not low, and many of them were cruel and experienced in killing. The middle-aged woman glanced at Soren and smiled. "Child. You look tired. Maybe you would like to go to the town to rest." She stretched out her palm and made an inviting gesture. Chapter 135. After listening to Soren's words, a middle-aged man next to him frowned and looked at the body. There were very few drows in the Frost Kingdom, and there was no passage connecting to the Underdark. If he hadn't been in the Underdark for a long time, he wouldn't have recognized the snake-head whip because the priest of the Queen of Spiders rarely fought. In Soren's memory, in addition to the believers of the Maiden of Pain, only the succubi in the abyss could give people a strange sense of pleasure when they were in pain. The Maiden of Pain was one of the gods who was best at using whip weapons, only slightly worse than the Queen of Succubus. The Queen of Spiders used the snake-head whip to torture the enemy. The others were still holding funerals. The middle-aged woman invited Soren to the location of the Temple of Agriculture. There was a small town in front of them, but it was closed on all sides, and there were many guards nearby. A burly man who looked like a sheriff came over, glanced at Soren in front of him, and then bowed slightly to the priest of the goddess of agriculture and said, "Priest Tina." "Who is he?" The middle-aged woman glanced at him and said slowly, "A traveling adventurer. Maybe he can help us." The evil degenerates have become more and more rampant recently. Now the number of people killed has reached more than a dozen. The residents of the town are a little panicked. "We must stop this madness." The sheriff obviously wanted to say something, but he swallowed it back. Since this happened more than half a month ago, the security team had not had the slightest clue, and the number of people killed increased again and again. At first, it was only one person. They could quietly cover it up and blame it on the ferocious bandits. But later, the number of people killed became 2, and recently, 3 people were killed at the same time. Now, even an idiot knew that this was definitely not a simple murder case. Looking at their injuries, they didn't look like crazy murderers, but more like victims of some evil ritual. Soren's eyes swept over him, and then stopped on a young man not far behind him. The other party noticed his gaze and avoided it. Although he didn't know why, he looked a little guilty. It was a skinny young man with brown hair and brown eyes. His legs seemed to be somewhat inconvenient, as if he was disabled. Soren stopped, looked at the young man and asked, "Who is he?" Hearing Soren's question, the young man subconsciously took half a step back. His eyes were slightly flustered. The middle-aged woman seemed to have noticed something. She frowned and said, "He is a blacksmith's apprentice. One of the victims outside is a blacksmith." Soren suddenly reached out and grabbed the young man's arm. With a twist of his hand, he pinned the young man to the ground. This sudden turn of events caught everyone off guard. Before they could ask, Soren said in a deep voice, "Get someone to take off his clothes." Everyone was stunned for a moment, but then the middle-aged woman gave the order with a serious expression. "What are you doing? He was just an outsider. You actually allowed him to attack me." The young man was obviously flustered. He struggled desperately and shouted at the same time, "I didn't kill anyone. Everyone knows that my legs are inconvenient. How could I kill Master Kent? Not to mention killing the others. I'm not the murderer." The sheriff frowned and said in a deep voice, "Let him go. Koro is just a poor child. He never received any combat training. He can't even beat a wolf. There were trained guards among the victims. He can't be the murderer." Soren looked at him indifferently. He directly took off the young man's arm and said slowly, "I didn't say he was the murderer. Take off his clothes." The 2 guards looked at each other and took off the young man's clothes. Immediately, the scars on his back were exposed. The others couldn't help but feel sorry for him because there were many scars on the young man's body. It seemed that he was beaten a lot in the past. The status of an apprentice in this era was very low. Soren looked at the scars on his shoulder. They seemed to be left behind by someone in the past. The sheriff said that he was a poor child. It was probably because he knew what happened to him in the past. But that wasn't what Soren was looking for. He directly tore off the young man's clothes and saw a hideous scar. The other scars were left a long time ago, but this scar was very fresh. It should have been left in the past month. Soren directly pressed the young man down, stepped on his neck with his foot, and said in a deep voice, "Has he been whipped recently?" Whipping. It was a very common punishment used to punish people who committed crimes. No. It was the middle-aged woman who answered Soren. She looked at the wound and frowned. "No one has been whipped recently. Our laws here rarely use whipping." Soren retracted his foot, looked down at the silent young man on the ground, and said slowly, "Don't tell me you whipped yourself for no reason, and with a barbed whip." He's a follower of the Maiden of Pain. It should be a ceremony that was held in the past month. The Maiden of Pain's followers have a whipping ceremony. They let people whip themselves with a barbed metal whip so that they can feel the power of pain and torture. I don't think I need to teach you what to do next, right? Find a way to pry open his mouth and make him tell you who the other followers are. The Maiden of Pain should have developed her religion here. Soren's expression was cold, and he didn't care about the sheriff's pale face. He had found a clue as soon as he arrived, but they had been busy for half a month without any results. This was a slap in the face. Take him away. The middle-aged woman's face was very ugly. When it came to matters of faith, the priests would also become very cruel. She said in a deep voice, "Torture him. Make him tell us who else has fallen to the evil side." The young man was lifted up by 2 guards. He stared at Soren and the others nearby with vicious eyes. Finally, he looked at the middle-aged woman with a ferocious expression and said, "You will all die. After the goddess of pain comes, she will torture you severely. In the end, she will kill you all. You bunch of hypocrites. What a hypocritical demon. You hypocritical bitch. You watched my mother die of illness, but you didn't want to save her. You watched me being beaten by the blacksmith, but you didn't do anything. You hypocrites. I curse you all. I curse you all to hell." He had fallen to become a follower of the goddess of pain. This young man must have experienced something bad. Unfortunately, Soren had no interest in knowing. He also didn't have such strong sympathy. He just said in a deep voice, "The followers of the goddess of pain have a high tolerance for pain. I think you'd better use some clever means when you torture him." The middle-aged woman's face was pale. She gave a look to a person next to her, then nodded slightly to Soren and said, "Thank you, adventurer. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have found someone who had fallen to this point so quickly." She led Soren to the temple, and the guard next to her dragged the young man away. The sheriff's face was gloomy for a while, then he followed them and kicked the young man hard. Since someone had fallen to the evil god's side, there must be more than one. There were actually followers of evil gods here, but as the sheriff, he didn't know anything about it. This would definitely cause his prestige to plummet. The Temple of Agriculture. There was a fountain in front of the shrine, and there were pools on all 4 sides. There were also plants planted there, and many pictures were carved on the walls. In the center was the statue of a beautiful and refined goddess. She had a gentle smile on her face, and her arms were spread out as if she was hugging something. There was a faint light inside the shrine. This was a place that was enveloped by divine power. It seemed that people often held sacrificial ceremonies here. The goddess of agriculture was a powerful goddess, and her temple was covered by more power than many other gods. The middle-aged woman asked someone to bring a glass of water, then raised her hand and made an inviting gesture. Soren glanced around and saw the statues of the goddess of the river and the goddess of the lake in the side hall. The fields needed water to irrigate, and these 2 weak gods were the most important gods of the goddess of agriculture. The middle-aged woman looked at him and smiled. "There should be news coming soon. I'm very grateful for your help. If you need, I can arrange for your accommodation. You look like you've been traveling for a long time. Maybe you need a good rest here." Soren nodded slightly and took a sip of the water. The water had a hint of sweetness. This was the raw material of the temple's holy water. The water was purified by divine power when it passed through the temple. The foundation of a temple was the accumulation of hundreds of years. The sheriff didn't let them wait too long, but the news he brought was not good. He walked in with a gloomy face, bowed slightly and said, "Pastor Tina." No matter how we interrogated him, he wouldn't speak. He just kept cursing us. I think his mind has been controlled by the evil god. The middle-aged pastor's face instantly turned gloomy. She glanced coldly at the sheriff in front of her and said slowly, "I only care about the results. I don't want to hear your incompetent excuses." The sheriff's face suddenly turned pale. He wanted to refute but didn't dare to speak. The sheriff was not a noble. He was just an elected administrator. His status was not higher than a knight, let alone an abbot of a temple. Soren frowned and stood up. He said slowly, "Let me do it." The Maiden of Pain is also the goddess of torture. Her believers have some special abilities after the ceremony. Many cruel tortures can't destroy their minds. If there is no special means, there is no way to make them speak through normal torture. The middle-aged woman nodded and immediately said, "Thank you, sir. When we get rid of this group of fallen, the temple will definitely reward you." Chapter 136. Inside the dark cell. Soren saw dried blood everywhere. It seemed like they had used it many times. There were charcoal, branding iron, leather whips, saws, and so on. The young man in front of them was no longer the same as before. There were dozens of whip marks on his body, and he looked bloody. There were scars left by branding iron on his chest and the side of his face. There was also the mark of a slave on his forehead. His fingernails were pulled out one by one. The bloody scene made the two girls behind the middle-aged woman's face change slightly. It seemed like they almost vomited, but they forced themselves to hold it back. You bunch. I curse you." The young man's speech was a little slurred. It seemed like he had used up too much of his strength because of the blood loss. But his eyes were still vicious, and he cursed them with a ferocious expression. The sheriff seemed to want to restore his prestige. He picked up the whip and gave the young man a hard slap. The sheriff gasped and said, "Priest Tina, look. His mind has been completely controlled by the evil god. No matter how much we torture him, he will only say this." The middle-aged woman's face changed slightly. It seemed like she had never seen so much blood. She turned around and looked at Soren. It seemed like she wanted to ask him if there was a way. Soren's expression was very calm. He had seen too many scenes, and the scene in front of him was nothing at all. He just slowly said, "Can you treat his injury? If this continues, he will soon die from excessive blood loss." The middle-aged woman hesitated for a moment. Then she raised her hand and cast a healing spell. The power of the divine spell began to take effect. The young man's blood quickly recovered, and he seemed to have recovered a lot. He opened his mouth and wanted to curse, but Soren stuffed a rag into his mouth, blocking the evil words that he wanted to blurt out. He turned around and looked at the others. He said softly, "The next scene might be a little unsuitable for children. I think it's better if you all leave." The people present were obviously hesitant. The middle-aged woman frowned. Then she turned around and walked outside. Her instincts told her that the adventurer in front of her might be telling the truth. She didn't want to see something that was too difficult to accept. The sheriff's expression was ugly, but he didn't walk out. He wanted to see what Soren was going to do. The young man in front of them had withstood almost all the torture without saying a word. He just kept cursing them for more than an hour. He did not believe that the adventurer in front of him could have any great means. "Step back a little." Soren looked at the others and gestured for them to stand far away. Then he said, "Don't talk and don't interrupt me. I need to be very focused on what I'm about to do. I don't want anyone to interrupt me. Understood?" His tone was very annoying, but his cold gaze made everyone shiver. It was as if they couldn't help but shiver. Soren smiled, but his expression was hard to describe. He walked up to the young man and whispered in his ear, as if he was talking to himself, "Do you know? I'm very depressed today. When I saw what you did, I suddenly felt that I've been a joke for the past month. I've brought Vivian so far away from a dangerous place, but it seems like I've entered another dangerous place. You really don't give me peace. It's hard to find a safe place to hide. I'm not that afraid of fighting, and I'm not that afraid of death. I just want her to grow up in a relatively safe environment. After all, she's only 8 years old. It's not too difficult to live away from some bloody killings and grow up happily, right? But it seems like the heavens are against me. Maybe there's really no place to escape. No matter what, I can't escape from this. Now think about it. Gloria's divination of Vivian said that she saw countless blood and fire. Maybe this is really fate. We've encountered so many things along the way. Even if we try our best to avoid them, we still encounter them. I don't know if it's my fate, or Vivian's fate. Maybe it's both of our fates. Actually, I don't know what I want to say. Maybe I just want to say it casually. Because what I'm going to do next is something you will never want to see. But you have to see it and feel the whole process because you are my work. Soren slowly pulled out the curved sword. His palm trembled slightly, but soon it was as steady as a rock. But his fingers were white, probably because he used too much force. He looked into the eyes of the young man in front of him and whispered, "The believers of the Maiden of Pain are actually very annoying. Because you have a specialty that resists pain and torture, normal torture is basically useless to you. When I was in the Underdark, I saw many priests of the Queen of Spiders being helpless against you. However, I know of a method that is quite useful for you guys. It just so happens that I once learned this method from someone. Do you know what it is?" Soren approached the other party's ear. This strange whisper increased the psychological pressure on the other party, making him feel uneasy. His whole body twisted, desperately trying to stay away from him. Soren smiled, but he looked like a demon. He whispered, "Skinning. My skills are actually not very good. The best skills are in the Abyss and Hell, and then the Underdark. But I think my skills will be better than the executioners in the mortal world. After all, I have received professional training. Do you know the Underdark? It's the territory of the Drows. They are masters of torture, and some of their methods are even crueler than the demons. Skinning is a delicate job. Only when you can peel off a complete human skin can you be considered a beginner. When I was a bitch, the drow who trained me was a master of torture. Do you know what he was wearing? It was a very powerful legendary equipment, stronger than many knight armor. That thing was called human skin magic armor. Only the most evil people, who are destined to fall into the abyss of hell after death, would wear this thing. He told me, for a qualified skinner, after you peel off a complete set of human skin, your work still needs to be alive. That's the real standard. Actually, I'm not sure if I can let you live, but you should be able to live for a while. After all, I have extraordinary dexterity, and there's a grade 3 priest outside." Soren's voice was so low that only the person next to him could hear it. The people standing in the distance could not hear anything. The young man who was hung up was trembling all over, and the fear in his eyes grew stronger. He opened his mouth to say something, but his mouth was gagged. In fact, he could only make muffled sounds. Soren raised his curved sword and looked at the other party with a smile as if he was chatting with a friend. "Actually, I would never do this kind of thing in the past. Unfortunately, you made me lower my bottom line a little today, because I'm really angry. Very, very angry. It's said that the followers of the goddess of torture enjoy pain. I don't know if you'll be able to enjoy the process. I know that you have good endurance, and I don't think you'll tell me what I want to know. But it's okay. I'm an honest person. I think it's better to let you experience my skills first, and then decide whether to tell me or not. Right?" Soren raised his curved sword expressionlessly, and then slowly but steadily cut along the top of the person's head. He did not use much strength, but his hand was very steady. He steadily cut from the scalp all the way to the back of the neck, and then from the skin on the spine all the way to the end of the spine. He steadily cut the first line. The victim's body was trembling, and the fear in his eyes almost completely covered the pain. He struggled with all his might, but he still felt the skin on his back being cut open. It was no longer just pain, and the pain was not as terrible as he imagined. The real horror was not the pain that was inflicted on him. The other people present seemed to have realized something. The sheriff's face changed slightly, and he turned his head away, not daring to look at Soren again. "Don't move." Soren gently choked his neck and said slowly, "If you move, the work will not be complete. This is just the back, next will be the arms and thighs. It is said that a skilled skinner can peel off the scalp first, and then deal with the other parts. I don't have such skills, so I can only deal with the other parts first, and let you see the other parts of your body." Blood dripped down drop by drop. Some of the guards could not stand it anymore, and they turned around and ran outside, as if they would have nightmares if they looked at it any longer. Soren carefully cut along the victim's arm, and then looked up at him. The victim's mouth was making muffled sounds, and his eyes were full of fear and begging. He said lightly, "It seems like you want to say something?" The victim nodded desperately, and he used a lot of strength. "Very good." Soren slowly put away his curved sword, and then said, "This work is actually very tiring, so it's good that you are willing to talk." Snap. Soren snapped his fingers, and removed the rag from the victim's mouth, and said to the back, "Ask the priest to come in. He is willing to talk." The sheriff's body stiffened, and then he walked outside. He did not know why his legs were trembling, and he almost fell to the ground. Sauron slowly retracted his scimitar with his back facing the victim. His hands were trembling slightly. But soon he took a deep breath, and all his emotions gradually calmed down. P.S. I have been updating twice for the past 2 days, so I will continue to update after I recover. Chapter 137. Amidst the snowstorm. A graceful figure wearing a snow-white mink coat slowly moved forward. Her footsteps were so light that there was almost no trace of her footsteps on the snow. When the bone-chilling wind and icy snowflakes approached her body, they seemed to have hit an invisible barrier and scattered around her. This was the wizard's protective energy field. Perhaps only high-grade wizards could use spell slots so extravagantly. This woman wore very little. Apart from the mink coat on her body, she only wore a close-fitting snow-white robe, revealing the exquisite outline of her delicate body. She wore black silk stockings on her legs. At a glance, one could tell that it wasn't silk from the surface world. The protective energy field could block the cold wind and ice, but it could not block the cold weather of the entire natural world. If she was not a professional with a strong physique, then she must have cast a spell to resist it. Damn droll. The woman's appearance was quite coquettish. If Soren was here, he would feel that she was vaguely familiar, but he might not be able to recognize her because her hair had turned lavender, and her pupils had turned blue. Her whole person was very different from before. However, some characteristics were still retained, such as the tone of voice, the fragrance on her body, and the stockings on her legs. Even high-grade wizards would not have too many enchanted stockings made of spider silk from the Underdark. This was Gloria's mother, the coquettish and vicious woman. She walked on the cold snowfield, wiped the sweat on her forehead, and then looked up at the sky. It seemed that she wanted to cast a spell to fly. This damn weather. The coquettish woman cursed angrily and then continued to move forward. The weather was too cold, and the wind was too cold. Casting a spell to fly required a protective spell. The higher she flew, the more piercing the wind would be. Even a high-grade witch like her couldn't use spells without any scruples. She had to reserve a spell slot to protect her life in battle. There seemed to be a sound coming from afar. The coquettish woman looked back and said with hatred, "These guys are like ghosts that won't go away. You don't care about the disciples of fear, but you chased me for half of the world. Didn't I already say that I won't continue the forbidden experiment? Wait till I get back my experimental subject, I'll definitely teach you a lesson. The light of a spell appeared. The coquettish woman's speed suddenly increased. Even though she was merely taking ordinary steps, it was as if she was running at full speed. Her speed was almost comparable to a professional athlete's 100-meter dash. The cold wind grew stronger and stronger. An eagle was forced to fall from the sky. In the face of nature, professionals were not fearless. The eagle that Droll transformed into could not fly as he wished in this kingdom of ice and snow. In the face of nature's might, even legends would be helpless. The druid landed and paused for a moment. Then, he frowned and looked into the distance, muttering, "Where did that destroyer of nature run off to? We can't let her go. Her existence is a disaster to the natural world." The three legendary Droll legends working together could not repair the damage she had left behind. She was now at the top of the Droll's blacklist. As long as it was a place where she had conducted magic experiments, there would be terrible energy radiation left behind. She was like a human-shaped self-propelled nuclear fusion radiator. In recent hundreds of years, no one had destroyed the natural environment more than she did. The cold wind was getting colder and colder. The coquettish woman walked dozens of kilometers away. Suddenly, she seemed to feel something. She cast a spell on herself, and then the outline of an eye, which was invisible to the naked eye, made of light appeared above her. The next moment, her expression changed slightly. She first said a northern dialect, which meant something like "Holy sh*T, then she murmured, "The knight in silver? This group of stubborn people don't really hate me that much, do they? Not only did they send a quasi-legendary level Droll to kill me, they even invited the knight in silver." She wanted to use teleportation spells, but teleportation spells could not be used indiscriminately. If a wizard did not prepare the teleportation coordinates in advance, it was possible to die by teleporting indiscriminately. If you were teleported into a rock, the rock would not automatically give way to you. There were only two results. One was that you hit the rock at an extreme speed. The speed of the space channel was very close to the speed of light. No matter how slow you were, you would be smashed to pieces. The other was the deviation of the spell. You were teleported into a rock. You were here, and the rock was here. Your body was merged with the rock. There had always been a lack of wizards who had just learned teleportation spells and lost their lives. Short-distance teleportation was still possible, but the longer the distance, the higher the requirement for the teleportation mark. This was something that even gods could not avoid. On a towering mountain, the proud figure of the knight in silver stood in front of the steep mountain wall. Her face was not very good. Presumably, no one would be in a good mood if they let a grade 3 rogue escape when they had the strength close to the legendary realm. At first, the tracking was relatively smooth, but after entering the ice area, it was completely broken. The other party seemed to have no rest at all. No matter how she tracked, she could only barely keep up. These days had made her a little tired, and the traces of the target were almost completely covered by the wind and snow. The longer the time dragged on, the more the energy of the leaf of life would be consumed. Even if the rogue was found, it would be impossible to retrieve the precious sacred object. This was a great loss for the Droll, and it was the same for the Elven Kingdom. The leaf of life had the most ancient energy. Although this energy was not powerful, it was very rare. It was also the only way to make their divine tree have divinity. The existence of the elven main god had become more and more inactive over the years, and many people had a trace of dissatisfaction in their hearts. Many high-grade Droll and elven elders thought that the most ancient faith should be restored and their divine tree should become a real god. The High Elven Divine Tree Faith. This plan had been stalled for thousands of years. The progress had been very slow because of the interference of the Elven Divine System. But recently, all the gods had fallen into a deep sleep, and the Elven main god could not connect with the priests. This was tantamount to a sudden opportunity. Many Droll thought that this was the best time to resurrect the Divine Tree. Although the Divine Tree did not die, its spirituality had long disappeared in the years. At this juncture, an accident happened to the remaining 3 leaves of life, and one of them was lost. Time was changing, customs were changing, and beliefs were changing. Suddenly, the knight in silver seemed to have discovered something. Her sharp eyes looked down at her feet like an eagle, and then there was a strange expression on her face. She seemed to have seen a very notorious witch among the elves. Northern Tower. Gloria stood at the top of the wizard tower, hundreds of meters high. The cold wind blew her long hair, and there were strands of silver in her silky long hair. It inexplicably gave her a sense of beauty that had settled down over the years. She looked down at the land under her feet, like a queen, and the area within 120 kilometers was her territory. As a high-grade member of the Witch Council, the Northern Witch who was most likely to advance to the legendary realm, she had touched the edge of the quasi-legendary realm before the age of 30. It was not impossible for her to reach the peak of the legendary realm in the future. In the distance, busy fishermen could be seen. It was the migration of the winter scale fish. Their habits were special. They would only lay eggs in spring. October was the harvest season. The fishermen would catch them with the size of the net and then let go of the small fish that had not yet grown up. For them, Gloria was a superior existence, and they were more in awe than the city lord of Moon River City. Gloria looked down at the people under her feet, opened her palm to catch a snowflake, and then sighed faintly. The weather was getting colder and colder. She tightened the wizard robe on her body and turned to walk into the tower. The heavy iron statue stood in front of the door and said with a voice of metal friction, "Master." The observation target is still sleeping, but the energy is also very stable. The things that were destroyed at the beginning have been repaired. On the 12th floor of the wizard tower, Vivian's small figure was lying on a platform covered with soft velvet. There was an oval protective cover outside. Gloria walked to a magic circle, and her figure appeared directly outside the door. She then glanced at the little girl who was breathing evenly on the platform and frowned. She had been sleeping for a long time. She did not need to eat, but she did not wake up. Occasionally, there would be unconscious energy spreading, and it even almost alarmed the Witch Council. The place where she was first placed had been destroyed. The violent divine power almost shattered her wizard tower into 2 pieces. If she had not activated the protective spell in time, Vivian could have destroyed half of the wall. The little girl's power was amazing. Gloria estimated that she had surpassed the level of a high-grade legend, profession level 25. Unless there was a way to separate these energies, she would need to sleep for a long time. Her body was too small and too young. But the power in her body was already stronger than an adult dragon. Unless she changed from a mortal to a demon, she could not integrate this power. The Son of God could transform his form. If Vivian changed into a high-grade demon or a descendant of a demon, she should be able to integrate this power. But the little girl seemed to have been resisting and fighting against this power. She was still a mortal, without any characteristics of a high-grade demon or a demon of the abyss. Gloria did not know how to let a mortal absorb such a huge amount of divine power. She was at her wit's end. As a northern witch close to the legendary level, Gloria was not a legendary wizard after all. She had not touched such a mysterious field. Unless she advanced to the legendary level, she could not even analyze the structure of divine power. The Frost Kingdom. Soren came out with a gloomy expression, and the middle-aged female priest also came out with a stiff face. The others looked very dignified, and no one spoke for a long time. The news they got was terrible. Because not only did the believers of the goddess of torture come here, but even her chosen came to the Frost Kingdom. The chosen of the gods. A natural legendary profession. She seemed to have come from the Underdark and had some drow features, but no one had seen her face clearly. She was a wizard with great power. She also came here more than half a month ago. You're tuning into the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.